SpongeBob has spent 25 years being called the most overanalyzed cartoon ever made, a show where every detail hides a secret. Fans have built entire channels around it, but most of those theories quietly faded before anyone asked the one question with a real answer. A show writer confirmed it on camera in 2024. This is Every Forgotten SpongeBob Theory, the Bikini Atoll Theory. Before the cartoon existed, before Steven Hillenburg had drawn a single frame or written a single line of dialogue, there was a real place in the Pacific Ocean with a name almost nobody in the Western world had ever heard. A small ring of coral islands sitting roughly halfway between Hawaii and Papua New Guinea, home to a community of people who had lived there for generations, who fished the same waters their parents and grandparents had fished, and who in 1946 were told by the United States military that they needed to leave. Just temporarily, they were told. Just long enough for the tests to be completed. The name of this place was Bikini Atoll, and the people who were removed from it never returned. The story of what happened there, in the years after those families were relocated, is not a story most people know, even people who can locate the place on a map, even people who grew up watching a cartoon set directly underneath it. The United States military brought ships into the lagoon, some of them old American hulls, some of them captured warships taken from countries defeated in the Second World War. Live animals were placed on the decks of those ships to study what radiation would do to living bodies at different distances from the blast. In July of 1946, a bomb was dropped from the air. A few weeks later, a second bomb was detonated underwater, directly inside the lagoon, sending a column of water and radioactive mist so high and so wide that photographs of it have circulated ever since as some of the most striking images of the entire atomic era. The military had planned a third test, but the contamination from the first two was worse than anyone had projected, and the third explosion was called off. The Bikini Islanders, moved from island to island in the surrounding area, began to experience serious food shortages as they tried to survive on land their traditional agricultural practices were not built for. That was 1946. The tests did not stop there. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States carried out 23 nuclear tests at Bikini Atoll. One of those tests, detonated on March 1, 1954, and known as Castle Bravo, produced an explosion equivalent to roughly 1,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs and destroyed 3 of the islands in the chain outright, scattering radioactive ash and fallout across the Marshall Islands and contaminating the ocean for hundreds of miles in every direction. The Bikini people were told, again, that they would eventually be able to return home. In the 1970s, scientists believed the islands were safe enough to attempt repopulation, and a group of nearly 200 Bikinians was brought back. By 1978, that decision had to be reversed. Testing showed that the returnees had absorbed more radioactive cesium from their environment than any known human population. They were removed again, this time permanently. The islands sit empty today. The contamination that settled into the coral and the food supply will not dissipate for thousands of years. All of that history sat waiting underneath a pineapple-shaped house and a fast food restaurant for more than 2 decades before anyone in a major public setting confirmed the connection out loud. Most fans who encountered the Bikini Atoll theory stumbled onto it through internet forums and video essays rather than anything the show's own creative team said directly, and for a long stretch of years the theory occupied an awkward position inside the fan community, widely known and widely repeated, but impossible to confirm as intentional rather than coincidental, since the show itself never addressed it directly within any episode. The name Bikini Bottom was explained away in 1,000 conversations as a simple pun, nothing more than the kind of wordplay a show built on ocean settings would naturally reach for, and anyone who tried to argue the connection kept running into the same wall. The show had never actually said so. That changed in December of 2024, during a cast reunion video produced by Esquire magazine that gathered the show's main voice performers together to discuss the series. In the middle of that conversation, with cameras running, Roger Bumpass, the actor behind Squidward Tentacles, brought up the Bikini Atoll theory and mentioned that he had personally spent years telling fans it was not true. The response from the person sitting near him stopped the conversation. Doug Lawrence, who writes for the show and voices Plankton, told Bumpass he had been wrong. The nuclear testing connection was not just plausible, Lawrence said, it was absolutely true from the start, and working out how far to take that premise had been part of the creative enjoyment of building the show's world. Bumpass's reaction made the moment particularly striking. He expressed open surprise on camera, acknowledging that he had been correcting fans at conventions and signings for years without realizing the answer he was giving them was wrong. That single exchange, lasting less than a minute, confirmed something fans had been arguing about in comment sections and forum threads since at least the early 2000s. The town of Bikini Bottom was built, from the very beginning, on the premise that that the creatures living there were the product of nuclear contamination. The talking sponge, the talking octopus, the talking starfish, the elaborate city with its restaurants and parks and boating schools, all of it was conceived as a picture of what mutation might look like if imagined by a marine science educator who loved the ocean and wanted to build something genuinely strange out of a real piece of history. The surreal, off-kilter logic that has always defined the show, the way ordinary things like driving a boat or cooking a burger carry enormous weight while genuinely catastrophic events pass without lasting consequence, sits differently once the idea of radiation shaping everyone in Bikini Bottom stops being fan theory and becomes confirmed creative intent. The theory accounts for specific details scattered across the show that otherwise exist without any in-universe explanation, and some of those details are considerably more precise than simply pointing out that Bikini Bottom sounds like the name of a real place. Sandy Cheeks, a Texan squirrel living inside an air-filled dome at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, has struck viewers as the most unexplained oddity in the main cast since the show's first season. A land mammal underwater requires a much more elaborate explanation than the show has ever offered directly, and the nuclear radiation theory provides one with a piece of real history attached to it. Records compiled about the Bikini Atoll testing period confirm that small animals were among those placed aboard target vessels to study radiation effects at close range, and chipmunks were reportedly kept on Navy ships in the area during some of those tests. Sandy is a squirrel rather than a chipmunk, and the gap between those two animals is not an insignificant one, but the structural logic holds. The presence of a small land mammal at the bottom of the Pacific becomes less random once the premise is that the entire ecosystem was warped by decades of surface-level nuclear activity. The leap from test subject chipmunk to mutated squirrel scientist is exactly the kind of loose, imaginative application of a real detail that a show built on playful surrealism would make. Some fans have also pointed to Sandy's name as a small, embedded reference to what the Castle Bravo test and the others did to the physical landscape of the area, since several of those blasts pulverized enormous quantities of coral and sediment, scattering radioactive particulate across the surrounding water. Whether that reading of her name was deliberate or coincidental on the writer's part is not something Lawrence's 2024 confirmation settled directly, but in the context of a show that was building nuclear history into its foundation from the start, small details like a scientist named Sandy existing at the bottom of the ocean tend to read differently once the larger frame is confirmed. The visual language the show uses for its explosions is another area where the theory finds specific, documentable ground. Almost every major explosion in the show follows the same basic shape, a distinctive column of water and spray rising into a wide, blooming formation at the top, and that shape matches photographs taken of the Baker detonation in 1946, the underwater bomb whose images became some of the most reproduced photographs of the entire atomic age. A deliberate decision to replicate the visual shape of a specific real nuclear test in a children's cartoon is a particular enough detail that it becomes difficult to explain as coincidence, especially once the underlying intent has been confirmed. Beyond that visual echo, an episode called Dying for Pi, examined in the reference material for this video, actually incorporated real archival footage from Operation Crossroads, the same series of nuclear tests that produced the Baker detonation, directly into the climactic explosion sequence of that episode. That footage was filmed at the real geographic location Bikini Bottom is built directly on top of. The show reached back into the historical archive of real nuclear test imagery and placed it inside a comedic scene about a pie, and for 25 years, most viewers watching that moment had no way of knowing what they were actually looking at. The overall aesthetic of Bikini Bottom as a world lends itself to the theory in a way that becomes difficult to unnotice once pointed out. The setting is built to resemble a specific historical era rather than a contemporary one, and that era is unmistakably mid-20th century America. Characters write letters rather than send digital messages. The appliances, the fashion, the general attitude toward work and authority all carry the specific flavor of 1950s suburban life. And the 1950s is precisely the decade when the nuclear tests at Bikini Atoll were at their most intense, culminating in Castle Bravo in 1954. If Bikini Bottom is the downstream product of those tests, the world its inhabitants built for themselves would logically carry the cultural imprint of that specific moment, the decade when everything above them changed, and the world as it existed at that point became the only available template for the civilization forming below. Rock Bottom, the location visited in a Season 1 episode where SpongeBob becomes stranded far below the normal ocean floor, has been folded into the theory as an extension of that same logic. The creatures living in Rock Bottom are visually stranger and more heavily mutated than anyone found in Bikini Bottom proper. Unable to speak in any language SpongeBob or the audience audience can follow, built from designs that push significantly further from recognizable anatomy. The theory positions rock bottom as a deeper impact zone produced by one of the more catastrophic detonations, a location that absorbed a heavier concentration of radiation and whose population reflects that difference in severity. The episode itself makes none of this explicit, but the visual contrast between the relatively coherent residents of Bikini Bottom and the deeply alien figures of Rock Bottom maps cleanly onto real-world patterns of contamination, where proximity to the blast site correlates with the depth of biological change in the surrounding environment. What makes this theory worth opening the video with is not simply that it was confirmed by someone present when the show was being made, though that confirmation is significant on its own terms. What makes it worth starting here is the specific shape of what confirmation means for a theory that spent over 2 decades living in the margins of fan culture. For most of those years, anyone repeating the Bikini Atoll theory was doing so without any official backing, running on internal evidence and the historical coincidence of the name alone. The pushback was consistent and came from multiple directions, including from members of the show's own cast who were answering fan questions at public events and giving people a wrong answer in good faith. The theory persisted anyway, partly because the evidence on screen was strong enough that a cast denial felt insufficient, and partly because the theory itself was interesting enough that fans wanted it to be true, regardless of whether they could confirm it. Lawrence's 2024 confirmation does not make the theory more interesting than it already was. What it does is remove the ambiguity that allowed the conversation to stay unresolved for so long, and it shifts something real about how the show reads once that ambiguity is gone. The character of SpongeBob, perpetually cheerful, perpetually undeterred, waking up every morning with the same alarm to the same small square house, working the same fryer at the same restaurant, existing in a world where catastrophe passes and leaves almost no lasting mark, carries a specific kind of weight once the setting is understood, not just as a pun on a swimsuit, but as a deliberate invocation of a place where 67 years of silence about radiation and displacement was built into the coral. Contamination does not announce itself. The Bikini Islanders, who returned to their home islands in the 1970s, did not know until it was too late that the food growing in their soil was still laced with the fallout of tests conducted decades before. The characters of Bikini Bottom do not know, and have never known, what shaped the world they were born into. They simply live in it, the way everyone does, making their particular kind of sense out of a world that was altered before they arrived, by forces they had no say in, from a distance so vast they could not even look up and see it. The show will almost certainly never address any of this directly in an episode. A children's cartoon about a fry cook and his friends is not the vehicle for a serious examination of what happened to the people of Bikini Atoll, and nothing in Lawrence's 2024 comments suggested the creative team ever intended it to be used that way. What was intended, based on what was said on camera, was something closer to a private reference embedded in the foundation of the world, a knowing nod to a real and specific piece of history folded into a name and a shape and a setting, then left there for anyone curious enough to trace it back to its source. 25 years passed before someone who knew the real answer said it out loud. For everyone who spent those years defending the theory in forums and comment sections and convention conversations, it turns out they were right. The test footage is in the show, the land mammal is in the cast, the shape of the bomb is in every explosion. The 1950s is in the architecture. It was there from the beginning. It just took a camera and a reunion to confirm it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A theory hidden in plain sight for 25 years finally got its confirmation in a single, unrehearsed camera moment. Next comes a theory that got a very different kind of answer in that same 2024 reunion. One the show's own writer addressed directly without ever quite saying yes or no. Section 2, the 7 deadly sins theory. 7 is a number with an unusual amount of cultural weight behind it. 7 days in a week, 7 notes in a musical scale, 7 wonders of the ancient world, and according to a long tradition in Christian theology, 7 specific vices that represent the full spectrum of human moral failure, each one broad enough to describe a recognizable pattern of behavior, while sharp enough to feel like a personal accusation when applied correctly. Greed, envy, sloth, wrath, pride, gluttony, lust. These 7 categories have been part of Western moral literature for over 1,000 years, worked through by theologians, painted onto cathedral walls, turned into the organizing principle of everything from Dante's journey through the afterlife to a modern thriller built around crime scenes. They endure because they are accurate. They describe things that real people actually do, rooted in impulses that feel recognizable, whether someone is approaching them from a religious framework or a purely secular one. At some point in the early years of internet culture, someone looked at the 7 main characters of SpongeBob SquarePants and noticed the number matched. That observation, which might have stayed a passing thought in a less connected era, instead turned turned into one of the most widely circulated fan theories the show has ever generated, one that has been repeated in articles, videos, forum threads, and classroom discussions for decades now. The theory is simple enough to explain in a single breath, and just complicated enough in its details to sustain an argument. SpongeBob represents lust, Patrick represents sloth, Squidward represents wrath, Mr. Krabs represents greed, Plankton represents envy, Sandy represents pride, Gary the Snail represents gluttony. 7 characters, 7 sins, and the show never tells viewers any of it directly. The easy assignments land first, and they land hard. Patrick Star and Sloth is one of the most intuitive character-to-concept pairings in the entire theory, requiring almost no argument to establish. Patrick lives under a rock, not metaphorically under a rock in the sense of being uninformed or disengaged from the world, but literally, physically, under a rock, which he lifts when he wants to participate in something and lowers again when he has had enough. An entire episode called Big Pink Loser builds its joke around the fact that Patrick received an award for doing absolutely nothing the longest, and treats that achievement with the same pride a more ambitious character might bring to a genuine accomplishment. His speech patterns carry the same quality, slow and slightly blurred at the edges, each word arriving with the particular unhurried quality of someone who has nowhere to be and no strong feelings about how long it takes to get there. Real starfish spend most of their existence motionless, attached to surfaces in the ocean, and the show's version of a starfish simply translated that biological fact into a personality trait and then pushed it as far as it would go without breaking the character entirely. Mr. Krabs and greed require even less argument. The entire premise of his existence as a character is an obsessive, unrelenting fixation on money that overrides every other consideration in his life whenever the two come into direct conflict. He has, across the show's run, endangered his employees, endangered his customers, endangered his own daughter, and endangered himself over amounts of money so small they barely register as meaningful even within the show's own fictional economy. The sound of a cash register is enough to make him weep with something resembling joy. Losing a single coin is enough to send him into something resembling grief. When an episode calls for him to demonstrate that he cares about something other than profit, the show usually plays that moment as a deliberate subversion of his established character, a surprise rather than a natural expression of who he is. He is greed made into a crab made into a cartoon, and the mapping is so clean that the theory almost feels redundant for this particular character. The show already made the connection explicit without needing anyone to name it. Plankton and envy work similarly well, though with slightly more nuance underneath the surface. Plankton runs a competing restaurant called the Chum Bucket directly across the street from the Krusty Krab, and virtually every episode featuring him as a main character is built around some version of the same plan. Steal the Krabby Patty secret formula, replicate its success, destroy Mr. Krabs' business from across the road. His entire life has been organized around his rivalry with Mr. Krabs since the two of them were children, as shown in a Season 5 episode called Friend or Foe that traces their history back to a shared origin. The envy is not just commercial. Plankton does not simply want the formula because it would give his food better flavor. He wants what Krabs has: the customers, the reputation, the social position of running the most successful restaurant in Bikini Bottom, and the way the show depicts his yearning for those things carries a bitterness that goes well beyond reasonable competitive ambition. An episode called The Algae's Always Greener let Plankton swap places with Mr. Krabs entirely, giving him the restaurant and the formula and the employees and the success. And he was still miserable, still unsatisfied, still fixated on the gap between what he had and what Krabs had, even after the gap was technically closed. That is envy in its most structurally accurate form, a desire whose object is not really the thing being chased, but the act of having more than the person being envied. The harder assignments are where the theory starts requiring actual effort to defend, and it is in those harder assignments that the conversation gets more interesting. Squidward and Wrath is a reasonable pairing, but a messier one than it might first appear. Wrath, in its theological sense, is not simply anger or frustration. It is uncontrolled rage, a hatred of the world and the people in it that goes beyond irritation into something closer to a wish for harm. Squidward's relationship with the world around him is undeniably sour and often genuinely mean, but a significant portion of his negative behavior is rooted in wounded pride and frustrated ambition rather than pure rage. He considers himself a gifted artist and musician, living in a town too small and too stupid to recognize his talents. Trapped in a job he finds beneath him, surrounded by neighbors he finds unbearable. That reads at least as much as pride misfiring as it does as wrath expressing itself, which creates a real problem for the theory's internal logic, since Sandy is typically assigned to pride, and the two characters would then be doubling up on the same sin from different angles. The counter-argument usually offered is that Squidward's wrath is primarily reactive, triggered by specific provocations from SpongeBob and the surrounding environment, rather than an ambient hatred of existence, and that this reactive quality is what distinguishes him from Sandy's more active, self-directed pride in her own abilities and origins. That argument holds up, but only if the definitions are applied carefully enough that the sin assignments stop being self-evident and start requiring explanation. Sandy and pride is stronger than it might initially seem, partly because pride is the sin that the theological tradition has historically considered the most dangerous of the seven, the root from which the others grow. Sandy defines herself through her intellect, her physical strength, her scientific credentials, and her Texas heritage, and she guards all four of those identity pillars with a ferocity that occasionally tips into something visibly self-destructive. A Season 1 episode called Texas builds its entire emotional arc around the fact that SpongeBob and Patrick making gentle jokes about her home state drives her to a level of genuine fury and violence that the episode frames as both understandable and excessive at the same time. A Season 2 episode called Squirrel Jokes places her in the position of watching SpongeBob build a comedy routine around the idea that squirrels are stupid, and her response is to engineer a situation where SpongeBob can experience being condescended to himself, a form of revenge built entirely around her inability to tolerate being perceived as lesser. Sandy will also, on more than one occasion across the show's run, allow her insistence on being right to get herself and others into serious trouble rather than acknowledge the possibility that someone else might know something she does not. Gary the Snail and Gluttony is the assignment that tends to generate the most skepticism on first encounter, partly because Gary is a pet rather than a character with a full personality built around any single trait, and partly because his most prominent characteristic is not eating, but rather his surprisingly high intelligence, hinted at across a number of episodes through details like his ability to read, his apparent command of multiple languages, and a dream sequence in which he is depicted lounging in a well-stocked library. The Gluttony connection usually gets defended through the running gag of his insistent meowing demands to be fed, which appears so frequently across the series that several episodes treat the reminder to feed Gary as a literal recurring plot element. An episode called Have You Seen This Snail is built around SpongeBob neglecting Gary's feedings for so long that Gary runs away and goes looking for a new owner, eventually ending up with a well-meaning elderly woman who overfeeds him to the point of genuine crisis. The episode treats Gary's hunger as a need genuine enough to drive a real emotional storyline, which is a different narrative register from the way the show treats most of the other characters' defining characteristics. SpongeBob himself and lust is the assignment that trips the theory up most severely for most people who encounter it, because the word lust carries a primary meaning in contemporary usage that has almost nothing to do with SpongeBob's personality as depicted across the show. The theological and historical definition of lust as a sin, however, is considerably broader than its modern shorthand. In a wider sense, lust describes an excessive, uncontrolled desire or craving, an overwhelming appetite for something beyond what is reasonable or healthy, and interpreted through that wider lens, SpongeBob's character fits the assignment more cleanly. His desire for approval, friendship, and connection is genuinely excessive in ways the show depicts directly. He pursues Squidward's friendship despite years of explicit rejection, repeated insults, and occasional genuine cruelty, in a way that crosses the line from optimism into something the show itself occasionally frames as compulsive. His attachment to his work at the Krusty Krab goes so far beyond what the job warrants that episodes built around threats to that work produce emotional reactions closer to grief than disappointment. He loves everything and everyone with an intensity that the people around him consistently find overwhelming, and that intensity is the specific quality the theory is pointing to when it assigns him to lust rather than any of the other 6 available options. In 2005, a religious broadcaster named James Dobson, who founded a media organization called Focus on the Family, made headlines by claiming that SpongeBob SquarePants was being used as a vehicle to promote homosexuality, specifically referencing a short video featuring SpongeBob alongside other animated characters that was being distributed to elementary schools as part of a tolerance message. Dobson's argument was that SpongeBob's warmth toward everyone around him, combined with his appearance in a video about acceptance and inclusion, amounted to a coded endorsement of something parents had not consented to be taught to their children. The claim was widely mocked at the time, and Nickelodeon issued a flat rejection of the premise. What makes the incident relevant here is that it landed directly on the same character trait the 7 deadly sins theory assigns to lust: SpongeBob's excessive, unqualified warmth toward every person he encounters, and it shows how differently that same quality can be read, depending entirely on the framework being applied to it. For the theory, that warmth is a spiritual vice lightly repurposed. For Dobson, that warmth was a political signal. For the show's creators, it was simply the central design of a cheerful, kind-hearted character built to anchor a cartoon about an ocean community. The question of whether any of this was intentional is the part of the theory that never fully resolved, even after the 2024 cast reunion gave the nuclear radiation theory its clear confirmation. Doug Lawrence, sitting in the same reunion video where he confirmed the Bikini Atoll connection, addressed the 7 deadly sins theory directly and offered something more complicated than a simple yes or no. His framing compared the show's character design to Gilligan's Island, a reference to an older American sitcom whose ensemble was often analyzed through the lens of which psychological type or social role each character represented. Lawrence suggested that the SpongeBob characters were built around the idea that each one would embody something specific and recognizable, a quality that made them immediately distinct from one another and easy to understand at a glance, but that pinning those qualities down to the specific language of biblical sin categories was more concrete than the actual thinking behind the characters warranted. It was like the 7 deadly sins, he said, without quite being the 7 deadly sins in the structured, intentional sense the theory implies. That answer is more interesting than either a clean yes or a clean no would have been. It confirms that the character design was built around a principle of giving each person in the ensemble one dominant quality that would define their behavior across any situation, which is exactly the structural logic the 7 deadly sins theory is identifying. It just stops short of confirming that the show's writers sat down with a list of the 7 sins in hand and assigned one to each character before writing a single episode. What Lawrence describes is a more organic process, one where the sin assignments emerged naturally from the decision to make each character a clear type, and where the mapping to the 7 deadly sins was a pattern a viewer could recognize after the fact without it having been consciously built into the design from the start. That distinction matters more than it might initially seem, because it changes what kind of truth the theory is claiming. If the 7 deadly sins were consciously embedded into the character design, the theory is discovering something the writers hid. If the mapping emerged naturally because human vice categories and cartoon character archetypes are drawing from the same underlying source material, namely, the full range of ways people can be excessive or flawed, then the theory is discovering something real but more diffuse than a deliberate code. Both possibilities are interesting. Both possibilities say something genuine about how the show was built. The difference is in whether the discovery belongs to the audience or the writers. And Lawrence's 2024 answer puts it somewhere in between, a creative framework that points in the direction of the 7 sins without having been constructed around them explicitly. What has kept the theory alive across more than 2 decades is not its precision but its usefulness. It gives a viewer a simple, memorable framework for understanding why 7 very different characters consistently behave in specific, predictable ways across hundreds of episodes, and it connects those behaviors to a moral vocabulary old enough that most people raised in any part of the Western world will recognize it immediately. The theory makes the show feel richer without making it feel heavy. It adds a dimension without requiring anyone to believe the cartoon was secretly a theology lesson. And in a landscape of fan theories that frequently reach for the darkest possible interpretation of a familiar piece of children's media, this particular theory has the unusual quality of being genuinely affectionate toward its subject, finding not horror underneath the surface, but a kind of accidental moral architecture built from character types that cartoons and religious texts were both always going to reach for eventually, because they are both ultimately in the business of taking the full range of human behavior and giving it a face. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A theory built on a list as old as medieval theology found its way into a cartoon about a sponge and a crab, confirmed as something without being confirmed as the thing itself. Next comes a theory that arrived with much more specific evidence attached, a single line of dialogue that a show creator eventually had to address directly. Section 3. The Krabby Patty Crab Meat Theory. Somebody designed the Krusty Krab to look exactly like a lobster trap. That decision was made early in the show's development, attributed to Steven Hillenburg himself, a man who spent years teaching marine biology before he ever touched an animation cell, and who brought the specific visual vocabulary of real ocean life into almost every design choice the show made in its earliest seasons. The anchor-shaped house for an old sailor, the rock-shaped home for a bottom-dwelling starfish, the dome of a tree dome for a land mammal who cannot breathe underwater, and a fast food restaurant built to look, from the outside, exactly like the kind of equipment used in the real world to trap and kill the specific species of crustacean who owns and operates the business inside it. Whether that detail was placed there as a joke, a piece of dark background irony, or simply a commitment to giving Bikini Bottom's architecture the same ocean-sourced logic as everything else in the world, the show never addressed it directly. It just built the building and moved on. For most of the show's run, that detail sat unnoticed unnoticed by the majority of viewers, present in every exterior shot of the restaurant without anyone connecting it to anything larger. Then, in 2017, a Reddit post assembled a collection of specific, documented details from across the show and built them into an argument that spread fast enough to reach mainstream entertainment outlets within days. The argument was this: the Krabby Patty secret formula, the single most protected piece of information in the entire world of Bikini Bottom, the thing Plankton has spent the entire run of the show trying to steal, the thing Mr. Krabs has sacrificed his dignity, his relationships, and his employees' well-being to protect on dozens of separate occasions, is made from crab meat. Specifically, it is made from other crabs, and the person running the restaurant where it is sold is himself a crab. The evidence assembled for this theory was not a single throwaway line or a vague visual implication. It was a stack of specific, individually verifiable details from the show, each one defensible on its own, and each one pointing in the same direction when read together. The first and most structural piece was the building itself, the Krusty Krab shaped like a lobster trap, a design that makes no practical sense as a restaurant and only makes sense if the building is meant to function, on some level, as a piece of dark visual commentary on what is actually happening inside it. Traps are built to lure things in. The Krusty Krab lures customers in. The customer that gets trapped in a real lobster trap typically becomes the product. The implication lands without anyone needing to spell it out. The second piece was the near-total absence of other crabs in Bikini Bottom as a species. The show is populated with talking fish of dozens of varieties, with octopuses, squirrels, starfish, clams, worms, and creatures unique to the show's own biology. Crabs, however, are essentially absent beyond Mr. Krabs himself, his mother Betsy, and the occasional background character who shares his species. The theory points to this absence as evidence of something darker, suggesting that the reason Bikini Bottom's crab population is so thin is directly related to where the Krusty Krab's product supply actually comes from. The restaurant at the center of the town's economy is, according to this reading, the reason the town has almost no crabs in it, and the crab who runs the restaurant has built his entire financial empire on the exploitation and processing of his own kind. The third piece is the one that put the theory on the map and kept it circulating long after most Reddit fan theories would have faded, and it comes from a specific episode in the show's third season called Midlife Crustacean. In that episode, Mr. Krabs goes through a crisis about his age and relevance, eventually dragging SpongeBob and Patrick into an ill-fated attempt to feel young again. During a scene in which Mr. Krabs eats a Krabby Patty, he pauses after tasting it and delivers a line that the theory treats as its single most compelling piece of evidence. He says, in the show's own dialogue, something to the effect that he now understands what he tastes like. The exact phrasing varies depending on the version being cited, but the implication is consistent. Mr. Krabs, upon eating a Krabby Patty, registers a personal, biological familiarity with its flavor that he would only register if the product contains something made from his own species. He does not say the formula contains crab meat. He does not need to. The moment the audience is meant to understand, according to the theory, is that a crab tasting a burger made from crabs would taste himself. The Krusty Krab's menu items offered one more thread to pull. The Reddit post pointed out that most food items on the menu follow a simple naming logic where the primary ingredient is named in the product. A kelp shake has kelp in it. Items with coral in the name have coral-related ingredients. The Krabby Patty, named with an obvious reference to crabs, would follow the same logic if the product line operates consistently. The counter-argument, which the theory acknowledged without resolving, is that the word Krabby more plausibly refers to Mr. Krabs himself rather than to the species, since the restaurant is named the Krusty Krab and all of its branded products follow a similar naming convention rooted in his personal branding rather than their ingredient list. That counter-argument is reasonable, but the theory is not making a single-point argument. It is stacking implications, and the menu naming contributes to the stack regardless of whether it holds up under individual scrutiny. The response from the people who actually made the show was swift, thorough, and unanimous, and it came from multiple directions at nearly the same time. Vincent Waller, the show's executive producer, addressed the theory directly in 2017 and stated clearly that Steven Hillenburg had confirmed to him that the Krabby Patty contains absolutely no meat and no animal product of any kind. That statement was not offered as Waller's personal opinion or as a creative preference. It was attributed specifically to Hillenburg, presented as information the creator had shared directly with the production team, meaning the answer carried the weight of the person who built the entire world the theory was trying to interpret. Doug Lawrence, who writes for the show and voices Plankton, addressed it separately and with considerably less diplomatic patience, calling the theory outright silly and pointing out that the show is set underwater, that the characters are themselves sea creatures, and that the entire premise of a carnivorous food product being served to sea creatures by a sea creature in an underwater underwater restaurant fell apart the moment basic logic was applied to it. His framing was that the Krabby Patty had always been vegetarian, from the very first episode through every season that followed, and that the idea of it containing animal products had simply never been part of the show's design. Tom Kenny, who voices SpongeBob and has been with the show since its first episode, offered a different kind of response to the question of what the Krabby Patty actually contains. His answer was hummus, delivered as a joke, the kind of answer that communicates that the question is not one the performers feel any particular need to take seriously while still technically participating in the conversation. Nickelodeon as an institution also weighed in, posting a direct statement on social media confirming that Krabby Patties are not made of crabs, described in absolute terms, without hedging or qualification. The denials came from the writer, the producer, the network, and two of the lead voice actors within a relatively short period of time following the theory's 2017 peak of visibility, which amounts to a remarkably comprehensive debunking effort for a piece of fan speculation about a cartoon burger. And yet the theory did not go away. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because the persistence of the crab meat theory after a debunking this complete and this well-sourced says something interesting about how fan theories function in the current media landscape, something that goes beyond the specific content of this particular argument. The denials from Hillenburg, Waller, Lawrence, Kenny, and Nickelodeon were all publicly available and widely reported. None of them were obscure or difficult to find, and the theory kept circulating anyway, reshared in the years following 2017 by people who had not encountered the debunking or who had encountered it and decided the debunking itself was part of the story worth telling. By 2023, the theory was viral again on TikTok, reaching a new generation of viewers encountering it for the first time, and the cycle of initial engagement and eventual debunking replayed itself with a slightly different audience than the one that had experienced it 6 years earlier. Part of the persistence comes from how satisfying the theory is structurally, independent of whether it is true. It takes a simple, darkly funny premise, a greedy businessman secretly running a cannibalism operation out of a novelty-shaped restaurant, and supports it with specific, citable evidence from the show itself, rather than relying entirely on vague implication or mood. The midlife crustacean line in particular has the quality of a detail that genuinely sounds like it should not be in a children's cartoon if the theory is true, and the gap between the innocence of its context and the darkness of its implication is exactly the kind of thing that spreads once someone points it out. Even after learning the line was never written to mean what the theory claims it means, the line does not stop sounding the way it sounds. The knowledge of what the writers intended does not replace the feeling of what the dialogue implies. Both things coexist once the theory has been planted, which is part of why debunking a well-constructed fan theory rarely makes the theory vanish. The Krabby Patty's real ingredients remain, officially, unknown, and that unknown is itself something the show spent considerable effort protecting over the years. An episode called Patty Caper establishes definitively that a genuine secret ingredient exists, and that it is valuable enough to be transported under serious security protocols, which rules out the most deflationary possible reading of the formula, the suggestion that there is no secret at all, and that Mr. Krabs invented the whole mystery as a misdirection to keep Plankton from focusing on ordinary business competition. Vincent Waller also confirmed in 2017 that Hillenburg never told anyone on the production team what the secret ingredient actually was, and in 2019, following Hillenburg's death in November of 2018, Waller clarified that Hillenburg appeared to have been the only person to have ever known the complete formula, meaning the single person who held the answer took it with him when he died. The greatest secret in Bikini Bottom is now genuinely unknowable, not because the show chose not to reveal it, but because the man who created the show never told anyone what it was, and now cannot. That outcome sits in a complicated relationship with the crab meat theory. The theory was debunked as definitively as a fan theory can be debunked, by the creator himself through an intermediary, and then directly by multiple other members of the production team. But the full, specific content of the formula remains hidden, and will likely never be confirmed in any episode. Hillenburg's policy during his lifetime was that the secret would never be revealed on screen, and since his death, the production has maintained that position, treating the mystery as something to be protected rather than resolved. What this means for the crab meat theory is that the debunking sits in a strange position. The formula does not contain crab meat. That much has been confirmed by the closest available sources. What it does contain has not been confirmed by anyone who knows, and may never be confirmed at all. The foreign language dubs of the show add a small, strange footnote to the whole conversation. In Turkish, the Krabby Patty is translated as a phrase meaning crab burger. In Japanese, it becomes kani burger, with kani being the Japanese word for crab, which is also why Mr. Krabs himself is called kani-san in the Japanese dub. Bulgarian, Latin American Spanish, and Russian translations all follow similar logic, rendering the product name in ways that translate directly to crab burger or crab sandwich in their respective languages. These translation choices were presumably made without the translators being particularly invested in the fan theory debate happening in English-language internet spaces, which means multiple separate localization teams around the world independently arrived at the conclusion that the most natural way to translate Krabby Patty was to lean into the crab connection. The show's own official international versions, across at least 5 separate language markets, have been selling a product literally called a crab burger for decades, which does not confirm the theory, but does create a certain irony given how emphatically the English language production denied it. A 2011 Robot Chicken segment, produced years before the theory reached its 2017 peak on Reddit, had already built a comedy sketch around the same premise, depicting SpongeBob revealing the Krusty Krab's full menu of sea creature-based products to horrified customers. The sketch treated the idea as a dark joke rather than a genuine theory, reaching for the same basic implication without framing it as something viewers were supposed to take seriously. That a major comedy sketch series thought to satirize this particular reading of the show a full 6 years before the theory went viral on Reddit suggests the basic shape of the idea had been circulating at a lower level for considerably longer than its 2017 peak implies, living in the background of fan conversations before it found the specific collection of textual evidence that gave it enough structure to spread widely. The crab meat theory is, in the end, an example of a specific and somewhat rare thing in the world of fan theories, one that was thoroughly, credibly, and officially refuted while somehow remaining in active circulation. Most theories exist in ambiguity, neither confirmed nor denied, surviving because the truth is unknown. This one survived with the truth fully stated and widely available, simply because the story it tells is too well constructed and too darkly funny to fully dislodge from the imagination once it has taken hold. Mr. Krabs is still a crab. The Krusty Krab is still shaped like a trap. The midlife crustacean line still sounds exactly the way it sounds. The formula is still secret, and the best explanation for what that formula actually contains is buried with the only person who ever knew. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A theory built from a single line of dialogue and a building shaped like a trap survived its own complete debunking and kept circulating anyway. Next comes a theory that never attracted the same level of attention, built not around the food, but around the employee who cooks it and the neighbor who watches him do it every single day. Section 4. The Squidward Guardian Theory. Squidward Tentacles has tried to move away exactly once across the entire run of the show. The episode is called Squidville, and it arrives in Season 2 after SpongeBob accidentally destroys Squidward's house with a reef blower, pushing his neighbor past his usual level of tolerance and into something closer to genuine resolve. Squidward relocates to a planned community called Tentacle Acres, a gated neighborhood populated entirely by other members of his own species, all of them sharing his aesthetic preferences, his taste in music, and his low opinion of chaos and disruption. For the first time in the series, Squidward has exactly what he has always claimed to want: peace, privacy, neighbors who understand him, and no SpongeBob anywhere in sight. The episode then spends its remaining runtime showing him grow slowly, then quickly, then desperately bored by a community so perfectly aligned with his preferences that there is nothing left to push against, nothing to resent, no irritant to sharpen himself on. He leaves, he goes back, he never tries again. That single failed attempt to escape has generated more discussion among fans trying to understand Squidward's situation than almost any other specific episode in the show's run, because it raises a question the show never directly answers. Squidward is an adult. He has a house he presumably owns. He has a job that, while clearly beneath his self-assessed abilities, provides a steady income. There is nothing visible in his circumstances that would legally or financially prevent him from simply packing his clarinet, listing the house, and moving somewhere far from the street he shares with SpongeBob and Patrick. He complains about his neighbors constantly, sincerely, and with a level of detail that suggests he has been cataloging every grievance for years. And yet, across hundreds of episodes spanning more than 2 decades of the show's run, he stays. Not because Tentacle Acres taught him that he needs SpongeBob in some sentimental sense, because the show never frames it that way. He stays without explanation, and the show treats that fact as background information rather than something requiring an answer. A Reddit theory that circulated in the mid-2010s decided to provide that answer, and the explanation it arrived at reframes almost every aspect of Squidward's relationship with SpongeBob in a single, fairly elegant move. According to the theory, Squidward is still on that street because he is being paid to be there. Not paid in any official, institutional sense, but paid by SpongeBob's parents, who hired him informally to function as a live-in guardian for their son, watching over him from the house next door under the cover of simply being a neighbor. The loan that allowed Squidward to move into to his Easter Island head house, a structure that would be difficult to explain on a cashier's salary from a fast food restaurant, came from SpongeBob's family. The pineapple house SpongeBob lives in, which is similarly difficult to account for on a fry cook's wages at the bottom of the ocean, was purchased for him by his parents. And the modest, slightly underwhelming home where SpongeBob's parents themselves live when they appear in the show, a structure that seems financially inconsistent with a family wealthy enough to buy their son a house and pay a neighbor's mortgage, is that way because the parents chose to spend their resources on keeping SpongeBob comfortable and safe rather than on upgrading their own living situation. The logic behind why SpongeBob's parents would make this arrangement rests on the most visible and most frequently discussed quirk of SpongeBob's character across the entire show: his repeated, catastrophic failure to pass his boating test at Mrs. Puff's boating school. SpongeBob fails this test in essentially every episode built around it. He fails it in circumstances where passing should be straightforward. He fails it in circumstances where outside forces almost guarantee success. He has failed it so many times, across so many seasons, that the show itself has had to build entire episodes around explaining why he keeps trying and never succeeding, and multiple characters within the show's own world have commented on the pattern with something between bafflement and resignation. The boating test is framed as a basic skill test, roughly equivalent to a driver's license exam, that any functioning adult in Bikini Bottom would be expected to be able to pass. SpongeBob cannot pass it. He has been trying for what appears to be most of his adult life, and there is no visible endpoint in sight. The theory reads this not as a running joke, which is how the show presents it, but as evidence of a genuine developmental limitation that SpongeBob's parents recognized early enough to build their financial planning around it. The specific condition most frequently suggested in discussions of this theory is ADH, pointed to through SpongeBob's difficulty regulating his attention during tests, his tendency to freeze or spiral when placed under pressure, his intense hyper-focus on specific tasks and interests, alongside his complete inability to perform in others, and his generally childlike emotional register, despite being an adult with a job and a home. The theory does not make a clinical claim, and nothing in the show's writing constitutes a diagnosis, but the structural argument being made is that SpongeBob's parents, presumably observant people who raised him and know him well, recognized that their son was going to need some form of support when he went out on his own, and that the support they were willing to fund was a neighbor who could serve as a quiet, unofficial backstop without SpongeBob ever needing to know the arrangement existed. The financial architecture the theory builds around this premise is where it gets its actual traction, because the money question is one the show creates and then leaves open without any attempt at resolution. SpongeBob owns a pineapple. It is a large, distinctive, apparently comfortable home with multiple rooms, a pet, functioning appliances, and a location in what appears to be a stable residential neighborhood. His job at the Krusty Krab pays him wages that Mr. Krabs has established across multiple episodes are as low as Mr. Krabs can possibly make them, while technically still paying something. An episode called Squid on Strike, which sees SpongeBob and Squidward going on a brief and unsuccessful labor protest, makes explicit that Mr. Krabs underpays both of them with almost no shame about it. The show never reconciles SpongeBob's income with his housing costs, and the theory treats that gap as the most important piece of evidence it has, arguing that the house was never purchased on SpongeBob's wages at all. Squidward's house creates the same problem from a different angle. Squidward is also employed by Mr. Krabs at the same wage structure, which means his income is similarly difficult to reconcile with home ownership in any realistic sense. His house is shaped like an Easter Island head, which is a custom structure with no obvious practical advantage over a conventional building, suggesting it was built to specification rather than purchased off an existing market. The theory's answer is that Squidward did not purchase his house through ordinary means either, but through a loan arrangement with SpongeBob's family that was structured to put him directly next door. The loan explains why Squidward cannot simply sell and leave, because leaving would break the arrangement and presumably end the financial relationship that makes his current life viable. It also explains the specific location of his house, which sits between SpongeBob's pineapple on one side and Patrick's rock on the other, a position that gives him direct visual and auditory access to both of his most frequent sources of disruption, which would be terrible real estate if chosen freely, and makes considerably more sense if the location was determined by the requirements of the job rather than Squidward's own preferences. Squidward's backstory within the show supports a version of this arrangement being plausible in ways that are easy to miss across casual viewing. He attended a performing arts school alongside a character named Squilliam Fancyson, who appears in multiple episodes as Squidward's primary rival and the living embodiment of everything Squidward once believed his career would become. Squilliam became successful. He has money, recognition, and the kind of artistic platform Squidward believes he deserved. Squidward ended up as a cashier at a fast food restaurant, a trajectory that multiple episodes treat as a source of genuine, sustained pain rather than a simple joke. The specific moment when Squidward's career aspirations collapsed has never been depicted directly on screen, but the theory fills that gap with the suggestion that SpongeBob's parents, who would have been socially connected enough in Bikini Bottom to be aware of Squidward's situation when it deteriorated, approached him at a low point and made an offer he was in no position to refuse. A modest house, a steady if unglamorous job at a restaurant owned by a family associate, and enough financial stability to keep pursuing his art privately, in exchange for keeping an eye on their son from the house next door. The detail that the theory leans on most heavily when making this case is the sheer consistency of Squidward's presence in SpongeBob's life, despite his constant, vocal, explicit desire to be elsewhere. Characters in this show who genuinely want to leave a situation find ways to leave it. Sandy came from Texas to study undersea life and built an entire custom habitat to do it. Plankton has constructed elaborate schemes requiring significant resources and intelligence. Patrick once became a mail carrier as part of a misguided attempt at professional ambition. People in this world do things when they want to do them. Squidward, who complains about SpongeBob more consistently than he does anything else, and who has the vocabulary and the self-awareness to clearly articulate what he wants and why he is not getting it, stays put. The theory says the reason he stays is the same reason anyone stays somewhere they would rather leave, because something they need is tied to being there, and the cost of leaving is higher than the cost of remaining. SpongeBob's parents, on the occasions they appear in the show, are depicted as small, relatively ordinary-looking sponges who live in a small, relatively ordinary house some distance from SpongeBob's pineapple. Their home does not communicate wealth in any obvious way. The theory reads that modesty as a deliberate choice rather than an accurate reflection of their financial situation, arguing that the family's real resources have been routed into SpongeBob's housing, Squidward's loan, and whatever arrangement keeps things stable on that particular street, rather than into upgrading the parents' own living conditions. There is a specific reading of SpongeBob's parents as people who redirected their financial priorities entirely around their son's needs, which is a fairly specific and recognizable parental behavior pattern, made unusual here only by the specific mechanism they chose to use, and the secrecy of the arrangement from SpongeBob's perspective. The theory also offers an explanation for why Squidward's resentment of SpongeBob, while real and consistent, never quite tips into the kind of total abandonment or genuine cruelty that would make the guardian arrangement impossible to maintain. Across the show's run, Squidward has his genuinely mean moments, but he also has a specific pattern of showing up when SpongeBob is in real trouble, often in ways that cost him something personally. He is reluctant about it, visibly uncomfortable with it, and usually tries to frame any act of assistance as something other than what it is. But the pattern is there, and it is distinct from the behavior of someone who simply hates his neighbor and wishes him harm. The theory reads that pattern as the underlying reality of the arrangement bleeding through the surface layer of Squidward's performed indifference. The actual job he agreed to do, showing up at the moments when doing nothing, would mean failing the terms of the deal he made. The question the theory cannot fully answer, and does not really try to, is what Squidward's own feelings are about the arrangement after however many years he has been living it. The show gives him enough genuine interiority through his art and his ambitions that he reads as a character with a real inner life rather than simply a comedy device built to react to SpongeBob. If the Guardian theory is correct, that inner life includes the specific weight of someone who traded one kind of future for another in a moment of crisis, and has been living in that trade ever since, unable to fully embrace what he has because what he has is not what he wanted, and unable to leave because leaving would cost him the stability that the arrangement provides. That is not a story the show ever explicitly tells, and most viewers would find it considerably heavier than the tone the series generally operates in, but it is a story that fits every visible piece of information the show provides about Squidward's life, his location, his employment, his finances, and his sustained, complicated proximity to a neighbor he has never been able to fully shake. What makes this theory worth including in a video about forgotten SpongeBob theories rather than simply forgotten SpongeBob jokes is the specific kind of reframing it performs on a character who is primarily coded as comic relief. Squidward's suffering is the show's most reliable joke engine, the dependable mechanism that converts SpongeBob's cheerful chaos into a series of escalating misfortunes for someone who deserved the outcome less than anyone around him. The Guardian theory does not diffuse that joke. It does not make Squidward's suffering unfunny or ask the audience to feel guilty for laughing. What it does is suggest that the joke and something else entirely can coexist in the same character, that the surface read and the buried read are both operating at the same time across every episode, and that the reason Squidward's frustration reads as genuine rather than cartoony across 2 decades of watching him endure things no reasonable person should have to endure might be because there is a real concern constraint underneath it, something the show never names but builds its entire neighbor and neighbor dynamic around, quietly, from the very beginning. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A neighbor who could never leave and a fry cook who could never quite explain his own house sit at the center of a theory that reframes one of the show's oldest jokes as something considerably more deliberate. Next comes a theory built not around a character's finances, but around a character's origins. One that turns a simple exclamation Mr. Krabs repeats throughout the show into the key that unlocks a story nobody on screen ever tells directly. Section 5, the Mother of Pearl Theory. Sometime in the first season of the show, Mr. Krabs is standing outside the Krusty Krab, watching SpongeBob and Patrick play with fishing hooks that have been dropped into the water from somewhere above the surface. The hooks drift down slowly and glow with a kind of golden light, baited with things that look appealing from a distance. And the joke the episode is building is that SpongeBob and Patrick are treating them like rides at an amusement park, hooking themselves voluntarily and swinging around without any understanding of what a hook actually is or what it is designed to do to whatever catches on it. Mr. Krabs watches this, and his reaction is not the irritation of a boss watching his employees waste time. It is fear. Genuine, almost physical fear. The kind that roots a person in place and makes them speak in a lower, more serious register than the situation around them seems to call for. He pulls SpongeBob aside and explains, with a weight that sits noticeably outside the episode's otherwise breezy tone, that hooks are not toys, that they are dangerous in a way that goes beyond ordinary bikini bottom danger, that whatever is on the other end of a hook is something nobody at the bottom of the ocean should want any part of. The episode is called Hooky, and it sits in the first season of the show, early enough that the writers were still establishing what each character was and what kinds of emotional registers they could occupy. The choice to give Mr. Krabs a fear response this specific, this grounded, and this disconnected from his usual money-focused preoccupations in that episode is unusual enough that fans have returned to the scene repeatedly over the years, searching for an explanation that goes beyond simple characterization. A crab being afraid of hooks has a surface logic, the same logic that makes a mouse afraid of traps, a recognition of the tool as something designed to catch and kill the species being threatened. But the specific quality of Mr. Krabs' fear in that scene, the way he speaks about hooks as though he has a personal history with them rather than simply a biological instinct to avoid them, is what drew the first serious attention to what would eventually become one of the more quietly affecting theories the show has generated. John Negroni, who built a reputation in fan theory circles through a detailed argument about how every Pixar film connects into a single shared timeline, assembled the clearest version of what became known as the Pearl Rescue Theory in a blog post from 2015 that reached a significant audience through social media sharing. The argument begins with the species mismatch, which is the most visible and most frequently discussed gap in the show's established world. Mr. Krabs is a crab. Pearl is a whale. This is treated as an established fact within the show's own world, rather than something that needs explaining, which is the cartoon logic approach the show applies to most of its more absurd premises. Characters do not comment on it. No episode addresses it directly. It is simply presented as true in the way that Squidward having 6 limbs and calling himself an octopus is simply presented as true, a detail the show plants and then leaves entirely alone. The official record around Pearl's origins is sparse, but not entirely empty. A trivia book produced in the early years of the show's run, written by former SpongeBob writer David Fain and released in 2000, contains a reference to Pearl taking after her mother rather than her father, which establishes the basic biological explanation for why she is a whale while her father is a crab. Her mother was also a whale, and Pearl inherited her species from that side of the family. This does not explain how a crab and a whale had a child together, and the book does not attempt to address that question, but it does at least confirm that the show's creators considered Pearl to be Mr. Krabs' biological daughter in the conventional sense rather than an adoption, which is the reading most fans defaulted to before the trivia book surfaced in wider circulation online. Stephen Hillenburg's position on Pearl's backstory was consistent and firmly held throughout his lifetime. According to creative director Vincent Waller, Hillenburg received a large number of letters from fans requesting an episode that explained Pearl's origins, and he was, in Waller's words, very much against solving that mystery. A plot outline for an episode that would have addressed her backstory was apparently written and reached early development stages at some point during the show's run, but the episode was shelved specifically because Hillenburg objected to it, and it has remained shelved since. His reasoning for protecting the mystery rather than resolving it was never laid out in any public statement that has survived, but the pattern of his decision-making around other unanswered questions in the show's world suggests a belief that some gaps in a fictional world function better as gaps than as answered questions. us that the imagination the audience applies to an unsolved mystery generates something more valuable than any specific answer could. The rescue theory builds its case from the fear scene in Hooky and extends it through a reading of several other small details distributed across the show's early seasons. The basic shape of the theory is this: Mr. Krabs, at some point in his past, encountered a whale who had been caught on a hook, a fishing line dropped from the surface by a human presence that exists in this world just as it does in the real one. Whether the whale was a stranger or someone Mr. Krabs had a prior relationship with is left open by the theory, though a more emotionally complete version of the argument usually positions her as someone he cared about, a companion or a partner. The whale died on the hook, or was dying on it, or had been killed by one prior to Mr. Krabs' arrival, and Pearl, an infant or a newborn at that point, was left behind. Mr. Krabs, motivated by grief, guilt, or simple compassion, in a moment that the show never depicts but the theory asks the audience to imagine, took Pearl home and raised her as his own. The hook scene in Hooky, read through this frame, transforms entirely. The fear Mr. Krabs shows is not the general caution of a crustacean who has learned that fishing equipment is dangerous. It is the specific, informed terror of someone who watched, firsthand, what a hook can do to a creature he cared about. Someone for whom the abstract danger of fishing equipment became concrete and personal in a single moment that reorganized his understanding of the world above the ocean's surface. When he pulls SpongeBob aside and speaks about hooks with that particular quiet seriousness, he is not simply being a responsible employer, he is being someone who knows exactly what the worst case looks like because he has seen it. Pearl's name sits at the center of the theory's most elegant piece of evidence, and it is a piece of evidence that the show itself offers directly rather than leaving it to inference. Pearl is named after the phrase mother of pearl, which is a real expression rooted in the world of marine biology, referring to the iridescent material called nacre that forms the inner layer of certain mollusk shells. The phrase is also used as a mild exclamation in English, the kind of surprised or startled utterance that replaces a stronger word in situations where a stronger word would be inappropriate. Mr. Krabs uses it throughout the show as his own signature exclamation, exactly this way, as a substitute for harsher language in moments of shock or fright. The show itself, through information shared by its creative team, has confirmed that Pearl was named specifically after this phrase, and that the naming choice was meant as a reference to the absence of Pearl's mother from the story. That confirmation adds a layer to the theory that the theory itself did not need but benefits from enormously. Mr. Krabs named his daughter after a phrase he uses when frightened. The phrase references mothers. Pearl has no mother visible anywhere in the show's world. A man who named his child after the exclamation he reaches for in moments of fear, using a phrase that invokes motherhood in the same breath, has embedded a piece of his own grief into the name he chose for the child he was raising alone. Whether that reading was the intent behind the naming choice, or simply a pattern the theory is projecting onto a coincidence, is something only the people who made the decision could answer, and Hillenburg's death in November of 2018 removed the person most likely to know. What exists is the fact, confirmed, that Pearl was named after the phrase, that the phrase is what Mr. Krabs says when scared, and that the phrase literally contains the word mother when spoken in full. An episode called Bossy Boots, which comes from the second season, shows Mr. Krabs having to teach Pearl the specific skills of a whale, including breaching, which involves surfacing and leaping from the water in the way that real whales do. The framing of the scene is played for comedy, Mr. Krabs awkwardly attempting to coach his enormous daughter through a behavior that comes naturally to her species, but the detail underneath the comedy is specific enough to generate its own questions. He is teaching her this himself, without a mother, without another whale present to model the behavior, because he is the only parent she has, and whale skills are apparently something she needed to learn from someone. Early photographs of Pearl's life, glimpsed in a later episode, show Mr. Krabs raising her alone from what appears to be infancy, with no maternal presence visible in any of the images. The show builds, across multiple episodes, a consistent picture of a single father doing his best with a child whose biological needs he is not personally equipped to understand, and the rescue theory argues that picture is consistent precisely because it reflects something real in the character's history. The financial dimension of Pearl's upbringing connects the rescue theory to the broader pattern of Mr. Krabs' behavior in ways that feel less like coincidence the more carefully they are examined. Mr. Krabs is, across every episode that features him, one of the most aggressively cost-conscious characters the show has ever produced. He has refused to replace broken equipment in his restaurant. He has reduced employee wages to the legal minimum and then looked for ways to reduce them further. He has put his own physical safety at risk rather than spend money he did not have to spend. And yet, consistently and across decades of episodes, when Pearl asks her father for money, he finds it. When Pearl needs something for school or for her social life or for the general maintenance of being a teenager in Bikini Bottom, Mr. Krabs produces the funds with a degree of willingness that is entirely inconsistent with how he handles every other financial demand placed on him. The rescue theory frames this not as a simple parental soft spot, though it reads as one on the surface, but as the behavior of someone who took on a responsibility in a moment of grief and has never once considered not honoring it, regardless of what it costs him, because the cost of not honoring it would be far higher than any amount of money. Separate from the rescue theory, another reading of Pearl's origins exists that takes the financial angle in a considerably darker direction. A Reddit theory posted some years after the rescue theory reached its peak circulation proposed that Mr. Krabs adopted Pearl not out of compassion or grief, but out of calculation, specifically because whale vomit, known in the real world as ambergris, has significant commercial value in the perfume industry. Ambergris is produced in the digestive systems of sperm whales and, when found in the ocean or on beaches, fetches extraordinary prices from fragrance manufacturers who use it as a fixative in high-end perfumes. The theory suggests that the secret ingredient in the Krabby Patty formula, which Hillenburg confirmed contains no animal products and which remains otherwise unknown, might not be whale vomit specifically, but that Mr. Krabs raised Pearl because having a whale in the family represented a long-term commercial resource his greedy mind was incapable of not exploiting. This version of the theory fits his established character considerably better than the rescue version does, which is precisely why it feels less satisfying. A story in which Mr. Krabs raised a whale child out of economic calculation rather than love is internally consistent with everything the show tells viewers about who he is, but it removes the emotional weight that makes the rescue theory worth remembering. The two versions of the theory sit in direct tension with each other in a way that mirrors a genuine ambiguity at the center of Mr. Krabs as a character across the show's full run. He is consistently depicted as someone whose greed overrides almost every other value he holds, and he is simultaneously the parent of a child he loves in a way that the greed does not override, a contradiction the show never resolves because resolving it would require committing to a cleaner reading of the character than the writing has ever wanted to make. The rescue theory says the love came first and the money came second. The ambergris theory says the money was always primary. The show's actual episodes provide evidence for both readings without choosing between them, which is almost certainly why Hillenburg was so resistant to an origin episode. Any answer would have collapsed a productive tension the ambiguity was holding open, forcing the audience to decide whether Mr. Krabs, at the moment that mattered most, was the person the rescue theory says he was, or the person the ambergris theory says he was. By leaving the origin unresolved, the show gets to keep both versions simultaneously, and the character becomes richer for carrying two incompatible histories at once, neither of which can be confirmed and neither of which can be dismissed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A single phrase Mr. Krabs repeats when frightened turned out to contain the name of his daughter and the ghost of a story the show never told. Next comes a theory built not around something hidden in the show's past, but around something happening to SpongeBob in the present, one that reframes his most consistent failure across the entire series as evidence of something much larger than a running joke. Section 6. The SpongeNam Theory. 6 o'clock in the morning is when it starts. Not approximately 6, not sometime around dawn, but 6 o'clock exactly, marked by an alarm that sounds less like a household clock and more like a bugle call, the specific piercing tone of a wake-up signal designed to bring a large group of people to their feet simultaneously and get them moving in the same direction at the same time. SpongeBob rises, makes his bed with the kind of precision that suggests he has made it the same way every day for as long as he can remember, feeds Gary, dresses in his uniform, and leaves for work. The routine does not vary, the timing does not slip. The uniform, a pressed white shirt, square pants, a tie, and shoes polished to a shine that reflects the light of whatever undersea morning looks like in Bikini Bottom, is the same every single day, across every season, across every episode, with almost no deviation that is not part of a specific plot, requiring him to wear something else temporarily before returning to the baseline. Most viewers watching this routine across dozens of episodes understand it as character design shorthand, a quick visual and behavioral signature that establishes SpongeBob as someone who approaches his life with enthusiasm and order, who finds genuine satisfaction in the small, repeating rituals of a day organized around the same job and the same neighborhood and the same small cluster of relationships. The routine reads as innocent. It reads as sweet. It reads as the kind of disciplined cheerfulness that makes SpongeBob a useful anchor for a show that often runs its surrounding characters through chaos and failure, because SpongeBob himself rarely fails at the things he genuinely cares about. He is extraordinarily good at his job. He is loyal to his friends. He maintains his home. He shows up on time. A theory that began circulating on Reddit in the early 2010s and eventually accumulated provided enough supporting detail to reach mainstream entertainment coverage, proposed that the routine is not a simple character trait at all. It is a coping mechanism. SpongeBob, according to this theory, is a military veteran, and the regimented structure of his daily life is not the natural expression of an optimistic personality, but the carefully maintained framework of someone who returned from something difficult and built a routine around himself specifically to hold his days together when nothing else would. The theory is sometimes called SpongeNam, a portmanteau that references both the character and the Vietnam War, though later versions of the argument are careful to note that the military conflict being referenced is never specified and does not need to be, since the behavioral pattern being described applies broadly to veterans of combat across any era rather than requiring a specific historical conflict to anchor it. The surface evidence is simple enough to list quickly, which is part of why the theory spread as easily as it did once someone assembled it into a single post. The bugle alarm is the most visible piece, a sound associated specifically with military reveille, the signal used across branches of the armed forces to wake soldiers in the morning, that has no particular reason to be the default alarm sound for a sea sponge living alone in a pineapple, unless the association is deliberate or the character's history makes it natural. The consistent, unvarying uniform reads as the kind of habit formed by extended periods where clothing choices were not personal decisions but institutional requirements, where wearing the same thing every day was not quirky but mandatory, and where the discipline of a pressed, clean, properly worn uniform carried weight beyond simple fashion. The specific way SpongeBob addresses Mr. Krabs as Sir, consistently and in contexts where a simple yes or no would suffice, maps cleanly onto the verbal habits of military service, where addressing a superior as Sir is reflexive rather than chosen. Beyond those surface details, the theory reaches into SpongeBob's emotional patterns across the show for its more substantive claims. Post-traumatic stress disorder, as understood in the decades of research that followed the Vietnam War and has continued through subsequent conflicts, tends to produce a specific cluster of behavioral and psychological features that the theory finds reflected across SpongeBob's character across the run of the show. Hypervigilance, the persistent state of heightened alert that keeps a person scanning their environment for threats that may not be present, shows up in the way SpongeBob's anxiety can escalate rapidly from zero to genuine panic over situations that other characters navigate with relative ease. His reaction to threats that the show frames as minor, including the multiple episodes where his fear of disappointing people or failing at a task produces responses disproportionate to the actual stakes, fits a pattern of nervous system activation that does not scale proportionally to real danger because the calibration has been altered by exposure to danger of a completely different magnitude. His driving, or more specifically, his catastrophic inability to drive safely, regardless of how much instruction he receives, becomes the theory's most detailed piece of evidence once the PTSD frame is applied to it. The boating test, as discussed in the previous section of this video in the context of the Guardian theory, is SpongeBob's most consistent and most documented failure across the entire run of the show. He cannot pass it. He has been trying for what appears to be the majority of his adult life. The show presents this as a running joke, and on the surface, it functions well as one, generating a reliable episode structure built around SpongeBob's catastrophic boating and Mrs. Puff's mounting despair. But the specific form his failure takes is worth examining more carefully than a simple reading of it as comic incompetence allows. SpongeBob does not fail the boating test because he lacks the intelligence to understand the rules of the road. He is, in other areas of his life, highly competent and in some cases genuinely skilled in ways that require real ability to develop. His cooking at the Krusty Krab is presented as a genuine talent refined through dedication. His jellyfish catching ability is depicted as something approaching mastery. He can construct elaborate objects, navigate complex social situations with more success than his apparent naivety would suggest, and learn new skills quickly in episodes that require him to acquire one for a plot reason. His boating failure is not a general intelligence or coordination problem. It is specifically and consistently a boating problem, triggered specifically by the moment he gets behind the wheel of a boat, which in the world of Bikini Bottom functions as this show's equivalent of a road vehicle. The theory reads that specific, localized failure as the signature of a trauma response rather than simple incompetence. A veteran who has difficulty with a specific type of vehicle, a specific environment, or a specific set of sensory inputs associated with a past traumatic experience does not fail because they have become less capable as a person. They fail because the specific trigger activates a response that overrides their normal functioning in that context while leaving everything else intact. SpongeBob can do almost anything except drive safely. He falls apart precisely, and only in the moments when he is behind the wheel. And the form his falling apart takes, escalating panic, loss of physical control, inability ability to respond to instruction in the moment, and a reset to his baseline self the moment the situation ends, matches what a trauma-triggered stress response looks like from the outside rather than what general incompetence looks like. Mrs. Puff's response to SpongeBob across the episodes built around their instructor-student relationship adds a layer to this reading that the theory typically uses as supplementary support. She is genuinely afraid of him behind the wheel, not in the exaggerated cartoon way that might accompany a simple joke about a bad driver, but in a way the show depicts as specific and personal, rooted in a history of near-death experiences that she has cataloged and continues to accumulate. An episode called Krabbyland, and more directly an episode called Mrs. Puff, You're Fired, establishes that Puff's relationship to SpongeBob's driving has genuinely affected her mental and physical well-being in ways she describes using the language of trauma rather than simple frustration. Two characters whose shared history consists almost entirely of a single repeated activity, one trying to teach and one failing to learn, have both accumulated something that looks less like a running joke and more like the residue of a genuinely distressing pattern, which is unusual territory for a children's cartoon to occupy without ever naming what it is depicting. The theory's most direct piece of in-show support comes from an episode called The Sponge Who Could Fly, which was marketed as a lost episode of the show and aired as a special during the third season. In that episode, SpongeBob is depicted dreaming about the ability to fly, and the emotional quality of those dream sequences, the specific relief and freedom they convey, reads in the theory's framing as the dream life of someone whose waking experience is constrained by something they cannot fully escape. The theory does not claim this is explicit, only that the emotional register of those sequences sits alongside the rest of the behavioral evidence in a way that accumulates rather than cancels. Sandy Cheeks provides an interesting counterpoint within the theory's own logic. If the chipmunk to squirrel reading of the nuclear radiation theory is taken seriously, Sandy's presence in Bikini Bottom as a researcher connected to a funding body from the surface represents a link between the underwater world and the institutional structures above it, which would include military structures. An episode called Chimps Ahoy establishes that Sandy is employed by a trio of chimpanzees named Professor Percy, Dr. Marmalade, and Lord Reginald, who operate from the surface and fund her research. Her mission, as revealed in the Sandy Cheeks film released on Netflix in 2024, was specifically to study sea creatures and their lifestyles on behalf of an organization called BOOTS. None of this confirms the SpongeNam theory directly, but it establishes a surface world with institutional reach into Bikini Bottom, which the theory uses loosely to suggest that whatever brought SpongeBob to the ocean floor, from wherever veterans in this world return from, is not entirely without connection to the broader world the show builds around its central community. The specific Reddit post most frequently cited as the origin of the theory in its clearest form describes SpongeBob as an ex-army soldier sent back to civilian life because of battle fatigue, attempting to build a normal existence around the structure and routine his service gave him, using the Krusty Krab, the way some veterans use employment, as a source of daily purpose and clear expectation that fills the space left by an institutional life that has ended. The framing in that original post is sympathetic rather than dark, treating SpongeBob's happiness not as delusion or denial, but as a genuine achievement, something he has built and maintains through considerable internal effort, the result of someone who decided, after difficult experience, to invest everything he had into the present moment and the small, reliable pleasures of a life organized around good work and genuine friendship. That reading sits in an interesting relationship with how the show depicts SpongeBob's emotional life in its stronger episodes. He is not simply cheerful in the way a character without depth is cheerful, because cheerfulness is the default state the writers gave him. He is cheerful in a way that sometimes requires visible effort, that occasionally cracks around the edges in episodes built around genuine loss or genuine threat, and that reassembles itself after those cracks in a way that suggests practice rather than natural resilience. An episode like Rockabye Bivalve, where he and Patrick raise a baby scallop together and he takes on the role of the working parent, shows him absorbing an enormous amount of stress and frustration before eventually breaking down and expressing something closer to exhaustion than his usual baseline. The reassembly that follows is quick, and the show does not dwell on it, but the pattern of breaking and recovering and returning to routine is visible enough in enough episodes that it supports the reading of his cheerfulness as constructed and maintained rather than simply given. None of this was confirmed by anyone on the show's creative team during Hillenburg's lifetime, and no voice actor or writer has addressed the SpongeNam theory in the same direct way that Lawrence addressed the nuclear radiation theory or the 7 deadly sins framing. It lives in the category of theories that fit the available evidence without having been either endorsed or denied by the people who would know, which means it functions differently from the confirmed theories and the officially debunked ones that have appeared earlier in this video. Its staying power comes not from official acknowledgement, but from the specific quality of the fit between the theory and the character, the way it accounts for details that do not need accounting for if SpongeBob is simply a cheerful cartoon sponge, and the way those details accumulate into a picture that feels less like projection and more like recognition the longer the list grows. What the SpongeNam theory ultimately offers is a way of reading SpongeBob's happiness that makes it mean more rather than less. The default reading of a relentlessly cheerful cartoon character is that the cheerfulness is the character, a design choice made to anchor a show and give it warmth. The theory's reading is that the cheerfulness is an achievement, something chosen and maintained by someone who had reasons to be something else entirely, and who decided, for whatever private reasons the show never reveals, to build his days around the bugle alarm, and the pressed uniform, and the perfect patty, and the same 6 friends on the same small street, and to find in that structure something worth protecting from everything the surface world is capable of dropping down into the water without warning or apology. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A regimented routine and a bugle alarm point toward a history the show never names and a character the cheerfulness quietly covers. Next comes a theory built not around what SpongeBob might be hiding, but around what Sandy Cheeks was sent to Bikini Bottom to find, and who exactly sent her there to find it. Section 7. The Sandy Cheeks Theory. Building a pressurized dome capable of sustaining a breathable air environment at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean is not a small engineering project. The materials required to construct something airtight enough to hold a stable atmosphere against the weight of an entire ocean pressing in from every direction would represent a significant technical achievement, even by the standards of a world where the laws of physics are applied loosely and cartoon logic fills the gaps. Sandy Cheeks arrived in Bikini Bottom already in possession of one, fully constructed, containing a living tree, a functioning home, and enough climate-controlled interior space to host guests, run scientific experiments, and practice a full range of athletic activities without leaving the dome at all. Nobody in the show ever asks how she built it, who paid for it, or how she transported it to the ocean floor. It simply exists, the way most things in Bikini Bottom simply exist, and the show moves on. The equipment Sandy wears outside the dome is equally precise. Her suit, which she requires anytime she leaves her controlled environment, functions like an astronaut's pressure suit adapted for an underwater environment rather than space, maintaining the air supply and structural integrity needed to keep a land mammal alive in conditions that would otherwise be immediately fatal to her. She moves freely through the ocean in it, fights in it, competes in athletic events in it, and builds and maintains complex machinery while wearing it, which means the suit is both highly functional and highly durable in ways that would represent serious engineering in any realistic context. A private citizen who relocated voluntarily to the bottom of the ocean for personal reasons and built their own habitat out of personal resources would face a nearly impossible set of logistical and financial hurdles. Sandy faces none of them. She arrived equipped, established herself without apparent difficulty, and has been operating from her tree dome ever since without any visible concern about funding, resupply, or institutional support. The fan theory that addresses this situation most directly frames Sandy not as a private researcher who chose Bikini Bottom out of personal curiosity, but as a deployed operative, funded and equipped by an external organization with specific research objectives that required a qualified scientist to be placed in close proximity to Bikini Bottom's population. The word spy appears in some versions of this theory, though the more precise versions settle on something closer to embedded researcher or government-adjacent field agent, since the activities the theory attributes to her are less about intelligence gathering in any military sense, and more about systematic scientific observation of a community whose very existence raises questions that surface institutions would have strong reasons to want answered. If the nuclear radiation theory is accurate, and a writer on the show confirmed in 2024 that it is, then the population of Bikini Bottom is the direct biological result of decades of American nuclear testing in the Pacific. The United States government, which conducted those tests and has spent decades managing the fallout of them in the literal and political sense, would have compelling institutional reasons to want someone watching those creatures, documenting their development, and reporting back on what the contamination produced in the generations that followed the initial blasts. The show provides the clearest direct evidence for this theory, not through implication or visual detail, but through an episode with a straightforward enough title that most viewers remember the basic plot without needing to be reminded of it. Chimps Ahoy, from Season 4, reveals that Sandy's research in Bikini Bottom is funded by a trio of chimpanzees operating from the surface, named Professor Percy, Dr. Marmalade, and Lord Reginald. These 3 characters arrive in Bikini Bottom to evaluate Sandy's work and decide whether her funding will continue, placing her her in the position of having to quickly produce impressive scientific results before a deadline she had not anticipated. The episode plays this as a comedy about scientific pressure and professional anxiety, and the chimpanzees function primarily as sources of comedic absurdity, demanding inventions that seem impossible, and reacting to Sandy's genuine achievements with the kind of arbitrary, uninformed criticism that makes them identifiable parodies of institutional funding bodies anywhere. The joke is not subtle. Any viewer who has ever had to justify a research budget to administrators who do not fully understand the work being funded will recognize the basic shape of the situation. What the episode establishes beneath the comedy, however, is something the theory treats as a significant structural revelation. Sandy does not fund herself. She does not operate independently. She answers to an organization that operates from the surface, that has been directing her work in Bikini Bottom, and that retains the ability to pull her funding and presumably remove her from the field entirely if her results do not meet their expectations. That organizational relationship existed before the episode and continues after it, meaning it is not a one-off plot device, but an established piece of Sandy's ongoing situation that the show introduced and then largely left in the background rather than returning to explore in any depth. The theory argues that the chimpanzees themselves are a layer of institutional cover rather than the actual source of the funding and the research mandate, and that the surface organization controlling Sandy's work connects, through whatever chain of scientific and governmental authority is plausible in this world, back to the nuclear testing program that created the environment she has been studying. Sandy's own stated research mission supports this reading when examined carefully. She came to Bikini Bottom specifically to study sea creatures and their lifestyles, which in isolation sounds like ordinary marine biology with a slightly unusual field component. In the context of a world where the nuclear radiation theory has been confirmed as the actual creative foundation of the show's setting, studying sea creatures and their lifestyles in Bikini Bottom means studying the behavioral, cognitive, and social development of organisms that are themselves the product of radioactive mutation across multiple generations. That is not ordinary marine biology. That is the specific scientific project that would follow a contamination event of the scale and duration that Bikini Atoll actually experienced. The systematic documentation of what the radiation produced in the organisms exposed to it, conducted under controlled field conditions over an extended period by a scientist with the appropriate credentials and the right equipment to survive the environment long-term. The technology Sandy produces from her tree dome across the show's run extends well beyond what a lone researcher working on a modest grant from 3 chimpanzees would be expected to generate. Her inventions include a manned rocket capable of reaching and surviving space, a teleportation device that successfully moves living beings between locations, a submarine that can shrink to microscopic size and navigate a living organism's internal biology, a molecular separator that can divide 2 beings fused at a cellular level, a cloning device capable of producing functional biological duplicates, and a variety of other technologies whose complexity sits several orders of magnitude above the level a single academic researcher with. Each of these inventions appears in a single episode, is used to resolve a specific plot problem, and is then never referenced again, which is standard practice for this show's approach to continuity. But the cumulative picture they build of a scientist operating alone in an ocean habitat with the resources to produce genuinely world-altering technology on a regular basis requires either a very generous reading of cartoon logic or some explanation for where the resources to build these things are actually coming from. The theory positions Sandy's technology level as consistent with institutional backing of a scale beyond 3 chimpanzee academics, specifically the kind of backing that would come from a government or government-adjacent organization with both the resources and the motivation to equip a long-term field researcher with whatever she needed to complete her mission effectively. A researcher documenting the biological outcomes of a major nuclear contamination event for an organization with a genuine national security interest in those outcomes would need equipment commensurate with the complexity and sensitivity of the work, and the equipment Sandy operates with across the show's run fits that scale considerably better than it fits the scale of academic funding. Her hibernation is the physical detail the theory uses as its most specific piece of biological evidence for what she actually is, rather than what she presents herself as. Real squirrels do not hibernate in the way the show depicts Sandy hibernating, a total biological shutdown so complete that she transforms physically during the process, emerging temporarily as a vastly larger, immensely stronger, semi-feral version of herself that does not recognize her friends and treats them as threats to be neutralized. The show plays Sandy's hibernation form for laughs across the episodes that depict it, but the transformation itself is genuinely unusual for a squirrel, whose hibernation in real life involves metabolic slowing rather than physical transformation and a aggressive behavior. The nuclear radiation theory, extended to Sandy's case specifically, would suggest that her biology has been altered in ways that squirrel biology alone does not account for, and that whatever she is not simply a squirrel who moved to the ocean. She is something the tests produced or something the tests affected, wearing the form of a species that was present at the testing site, shaped by the same contamination event that shaped everything else in Bikini Bottom, including the creatures she arrived there to study. That reading creates a genuinely strange loop at the center of the theory. If Sandy was sent to study the mutated creatures of Bikini Bottom, and Sandy herself is the product of the same contamination that created those creatures, then the organization that sent her there either does not know what she is, which would represent a significant failure of institutional awareness about their own field operative, or they know exactly what she is and chose her specifically because her own altered biology makes her better suited to surviving and operating in the environment she was sent to study. The second option is considerably more interesting as a piece of storytelling logic, and it fits the show's own depiction of Sandy's physical capabilities, which extend well beyond what a normal squirrel's biology would produce. She is one of the physically strongest characters in the entire show, capable of pulling ocean-going ships from the surface and overpowering creatures many times her size, attributes the show treats as expressions of her Texas toughness and athletic dedication rather than evidence of anything more unusual about her physiology. The 2024 Netflix film Saving Bikini Bottom formally named the organization Sandy works for as BOOTS, adding a layer of institutional specificity that earlier episodes had not provided. The film does not fully explain what BOOTS is, or what its relationship to surface governments and scientific institutions looks like, which is consistent with the show's general approach to Sandy's backstory, providing enough detail to suggest depth without committing to the kind of specific answers that would close down interpretive possibilities. The naming of the organization at least confirms that Sandy's work in Bikini Bottom has always been institutional rather than personal, that there was always a structure behind her presence there, larger than her own scientific curiosity, and that the film's creative team considered this piece of her character important enough to formalize 2.5 decades into the show's run. Sandy's relationship with SpongeBob across the show's run is worth considering through the theory's frame, because it carries a specific quality that the theory would predict. She is genuinely fond of him. The fondness is real, depicted consistently and without irony across dozens of episodes, and it sits alongside a pattern of using SpongeBob and other Bikini Bottom residents as subjects for experiments, tests, and demonstrations of her various inventions, which she does repeatedly and with what appears to be the casual comfort of someone accustomed to working with this particular population as research material. The show frames this as normal scientific enthusiasm, rather than anything more calculated, but the pattern of a researcher developing genuine personal attachment to the subjects of her long-term field study while continuing to use them as experimental subjects is one that real scientific ethics has grappled with in contexts involving human and animal research. Sandy occupies both positions simultaneously across the show's run, the friend and the observer, in a way that the theory argues is not accidental but structural, built into a character whose mission always required her to be both things at once. Whether the show ever intended any of this as a coherent theory about Sandy's institutional role is almost certainly not something that can be confirmed at this point, and the specific chain of reasoning that connects the chimpanzees to a government nuclear monitoring program involves enough inferential leaps that it belongs firmly in the category of fan construction rather than discovered intent. What the theory does well is take a genuine structural peculiarity of Sandy's character, the gap between her stated role as a modest field researcher and the actual scale of her equipment, capabilities, and organizational backing, and offer an explanation that fits all the available evidence without requiring anything the show has established to be false. A lone researcher does not build space rockets and teleporters on a chimp grant. Something else is funding that work, and the most coherent explanation for what that something else might be, given the confirmed nuclear foundation of the show's setting, is an institution with both the resources and the reasons to want a qualified scientist watching Bikini Bottom from the inside for as long as the observation takes. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A researcher with technology no field grant could explain, and an employer nobody ever fully named, sits at the center of a theory built from the show's own institutional details. Next comes a theory that turns away from any single character and toward the show's most protected object, asking not what the formula contains, but what Mr. Krabs exchanged in order to make it successful in the first place. Section 8. The Mr. Krabs sold his soul theory. Folklore about selling one's soul typically assumes the seller does it once. One moment of desperation or ambition, one visitor at the crossroads, one signature on a contract, and the deal is finished. The mythology does not generally account for serial sellers, people who return to the same kind of arrangement repeatedly across the course of a lifetime, trading the same asset to different buyers for different prices, building what looks less like a single act of desperation and more like an ongoing commercial relationship with the supernatural. Mr. Krabs is, according to his own show's internal record, exactly that kind of serial seller. The show confirmed this detail in a single episode, in a scene that passes so quickly that most viewers who encountered it never registered what had actually just been established, and it has sat largely unexamined in the background of the show's mythology ever since. The episode is called Money Talks, and it comes from the 5th season. The premise is built around one of Mr. Krabs' most fundamental frustrations, which is that money, despite being the organizing principle of his entire existence, cannot talk back to him. He looks at the coins and bills that pass through the Krusty Krab every day and feels a connection to them that he cannot reciprocate, a one-sided relationship that bothers him in a way the show plays as both comic and, in its quieter moments, slightly sad. He wishes, genuinely and repeatedly, that he could communicate with money directly, could hear from the bills what they want, where they would prefer to be spent, how they would choose to be handled if the choice were theirs. This is not a casual wish. It consumes him enough that he seeks out a supernatural solution to the problem. The Flying Dutchman, a ghost ship captain who drifts through the show's world as an unpredictable supernatural force, hears the wish and appears with an offer. He can grant Mr. Krabs the ability to communicate with money directly, in exchange for his soul. Mr. Krabs, characteristically, tries to negotiate rather than simply accepting or refusing, and the back and forth between them occupies most of the episode's middle section, with Mr. Krabs treating the acquisition of supernatural ability as a purchasing negotiation rather than a moral transaction. The ability is eventually granted. Mr. Krabs gets what he asked for, can suddenly hear money speaking to him, and discovers almost immediately that the experience is considerably less satisfying than the wish suggested it would be, since the money turns out to have opinions and preferences that do not align with Mr. Krabs' own plans for it. The episode's final joke is the piece that matters most for the theory, and it arrives as a quick coda after the main plot has resolved. When the Flying Dutchman comes to collect Mr. Krabs' soul, something unexpected stops him. It turns out that Mr. Krabs does not have his soul available to hand over because he has already committed it to other parties in prior deals. The number of prior commitments established in that single brief scene is 8. Mr. Krabs has sold his soul 8 separate times before the events of this episode to 8 separate supernatural entities, leaving him in the position of having nothing left to give the Flying Dutchman, despite having just accepted his offer. The Dutchman leaves empty-handed, and the episode ends on that note without exploring what it means, what the 8 prior deals were, or what Mr. Krabs received in exchange for each of them. The theory that grew up around this detail asked the question the episode declined to answer. 8 soul transactions, each one presumably carrying some exchange of value, represent a significant commercial history with the supernatural. The soul-selling mythology that the Flying Dutchman's presence in this episode is drawing from, a tradition running from medieval Christian literature through Faust, through the Robert Johnson Crossroads legend, and into contemporary popular culture, consistently treats the soul as an asset traded for something specific and significant: power, knowledge, talent, success that could not be achieved through ordinary means. The question the theory asks is what Mr. Krabs purchased across 8 transactions, and the evidence it assembles to answer that question comes from the show's own depiction of Mr. Krabs' physical and perceptual abilities across hundreds of episodes. The abilities the theory catalogs are scattered across individual episodes without any consistent in-universe explanation for how a crab of ordinary biology would come to possess them, and they were assembled by a Reddit user who went through the show systematically looking for moments where Mr. Krabs does something that cannot be fully accounted for by cartoon logic alone. Super strength is the most frequently cited and most visually obvious. Mr. Krabs demonstrates physical strength across the show's run that exceeds what the other characters around him are capable of, in ways that go beyond the general elasticity the show applies to cartoon physics. He has lifted, thrown, and physically displaced objects and characters at a scale that positions him as one of the physically strongest figures in Bikini Bottom, which is unusual for a small crustacean in a world populated by much larger creatures. The show never explains why he is this strong. He simply is, in the episodes that require it. Detection is the second ability the theory points to, and it is more specific than the strength claim. Mr. Krabs has, across multiple episodes, demonstrated an ability to sense the presence of money at distances and through barriers that should make that impossible. He can smell a single coin from what the show implies is a significant distance. He can hear the sound of a transaction happening behind closed doors, through walls, at volumes that should be inaudible. An episode built around him being separated from the Krusty Krab shows him orienting toward money with a directional precision that resembles something closer to a specialized sense organ than an ordinary nose. The theory frames this ability as something that was not always present in Mr. Krabs' biology, since nothing about crab anatomy would produce this specific capacity, and positions it as something he acquired through one of his 8 prior transactions, a targeted enhancement of a sense relevant to his specific obsession. Looking through a telephone, teleportation across short distances, and an ability to withstand physical punishment that would incapacitate other characters are the remaining abilities the Reddit post identified and cited with specific episode references. None of these abilities are treated as remarkable within the show, which is part of what makes them easy to overlook. Cartoon physics allow most characters to absorb and recover from injuries quickly, and small inconsistencies in what a character can physically do are easily attributed to the general flexibility of animation, rather than to anything specifically unusual about the character. The theory's argument is that the pattern of unusual abilities attached specifically and consistently to Mr. Krabs, rather than being distributed across the cast, is too concentrated to dismiss as general cartoon logic, and that the in-universe explanation the show itself provides, the 8 prior soul transactions, is the most economical way to account for the pattern. The Krusty Krab's commercial success is where the theory finds its most structurally interesting piece of evidence. Plankton's efforts to compete with the Krusty Krab represent one of the show's longest-running narrative threads, and they have consistently failed across the entire run of the series, despite Plankton being depicted as significantly more intelligent than Mr. Krabs in almost every measurable way. Plankton has a computer wife with analytical capabilities. He has advanced scientific knowledge and the ability to construct genuinely sophisticated technology from scratch. He has a systematic, strategic approach to his rivalry with Mr. Krabs that should, under ordinary competitive conditions, have produced at least occasional meaningful success. It has not. The Chum Bucket has never managed to draw a significant customer base, despite operating directly across the street from its rival for the entire run of the show. The Krusty Krab continues to succeed despite Mr. Krabs' documented willingness to cut corners on every aspect of his business that does not directly affect the food itself. The theory positions the Krusty Krab's improbable, sustained success as the primary thing Mr. Krabs purchased across his 8 soul transactions. A restaurant run by a greedy, cost-cutting owner who underpays his staff, maintains his equipment at minimum viable standards, and regularly endangers his customers through decisions driven by financial calculation rather than safety, should not be the most beloved eating establishment in an entire city. The food, which SpongeBob's cooking skills contribute enormously to, is genuinely good, but the food alone does not account for the loyalty, the volume, and the consistency of the Krusty Krab's customer base across decades of in-universe time. Something is drawing those customers back repeatedly and keeping them from taking their business across the street to a competitor who, at minimum, has a more scientifically sophisticated approach to food production. The theory suggests that something is the accumulated result of 8 separate transactions with supernatural entities, each one purchasing a small additional advantage that compounds across time into the kind of inexplicable commercial dominance the Krusty Krab has maintained across the show's entire run. The specific entities Mr. Krabs sold his soul to, beyond the Flying Dutchman, have never been identified in any episode. The show simply states that 8 prior deals exist and moves on, which leaves the full roster of supernatural creditors entirely to the imagination of anyone who wants to construct it. Some fan discussions have suggested that the character of King Neptune, who appears as a powerful, short-tempered godlike figure in multiple episodes and in the first film, might represent one of those prior creditors, since his relationship with Mr. Krabs in those appearances carries a specific quality of grudging tolerance rather than the open hostility he brings to interactions with characters he has no prior history with. Whether that reading holds up under examination of the specific episodes it draws from is debatable, but the impulse behind it reflects the theory's broader invitation to look at every supernatural entity in the show's world and ask whether Mr. Krabs has a history with them that the show has not made explicit. The soul-selling mythology the episode is drawing from has a specific traditional structure that the theory uses to complicate the moral reading of Mr. Krabs as a character. In most versions of the folklore, the soul seller is presented as someone who traded something fundamental about themselves for temporary gain, and the traditional moral of those stories is that what was given up was worth more than what was received. Mr. Krabs' version of the arrangement inverts this moral in a specific way. He sold his soul 8 times to 8 separate buyers, and then sold it a 9th time to the Flying Dutchman, despite having nothing left to hand over, completing a transaction he could not honor and walking away from the debt. He cheated every one of his supernatural creditors in exactly the way he would cheat any ordinary business partner, by accepting the payment and and then finding a way to avoid delivering what he promised. The show frames the final scene as a joke about his incorrigible greed, which it is, but it is also a depiction of someone who took the oldest and most serious transaction in the mythology and turned it into a standard Krabs business maneuver, treating his own soul the way he treats every other resource available to him, something to be sold at maximum price and replaced at minimum cost. That reading adds a specific dimension to the theory's larger claim about what the 8 transactions purchased. If Mr. Krabs is the kind of person who could sell his soul 9 times and remain functionally intact afterward, the soul transactions did not fundamentally change him. They gave him abilities and advantages he did not previously have, while leaving his essential character, the greed, the calculation, the willingness to exploit any available resource, completely unaltered. Whatever was traded away across those 8 transactions was not the part of him that makes him recognizably himself. This is either a horror about what he is at his core, a reading the show never pushes toward, or a comedy about the limits of what supernatural entities can actually take from someone whose entire being is already organized around transactional thinking. A reading the show handles more comfortably. The theory has never been officially addressed by the show's creative team in any format that has been made public, and it sits in the same ambiguous category as the SpongeNam theory and the Guardian theory, confirmed by nothing and denied by nothing, living entirely on the strength of the textual evidence the show provides and the internal logic of the argument that connects that evidence into a coherent shape. What keeps it alive in fan discussions is not the darkness of its implications, since the show's own handling of soul selling is breezy enough that it diffuses most of the horror the concept would carry in another context. What keeps it alive is the specific, verifiable detail of 8 prior transactions, confirmed in the show's own dialogue, sitting there without explanation across every episode that has aired since Money Talks first reached viewers, an established piece of in-universe history that the show introduced and then deliberately left for the audience to do something with. Mr. Krabs has sold his soul 8 times, at minimum. He has received something in exchange for each sale. The show knows what those things are and has chosen, consistently and across years of subsequent episodes, not to say. That silence is either an oversight, which, given the specificity of the original detail, seems unlikely, or a choice, which, given Hillenberg's documented preference for leaving certain questions open as productive mysteries, seems considerably more plausible. Either way, the number 8 sits in the middle of the show's mythology like an unread contract, signed and dated and filed, waiting for someone to go back and look at what was actually agreed to. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 8 transactions with the supernatural and a restaurant that should have failed long ago sit at the center of a theory the show seeded and walked away from. Next comes a theory that moves away from any single character's history and toward the shape of the show itself, asking whether the world SpongeBob lives in is operating the way it appears to be operating at all. Section 9. The Eternal Reset Theory. Somewhere in the show's long run, a frame from an episode paused long enough for a viewer to read the details on SpongeBob's identification card and write them down. The birth date printed on that card, glimpsed briefly in a scene from the special episode Truth or Square, which aired in 2009 to mark the show's 10th anniversary, reads July 14, 1986. The show itself premiered on Nickelodeon on May 1, 1999. If that birth date is taken at face value as accurate in-universe information, SpongeBob was 13 years old when the show began, which would make him somewhere in his mid-20s by the time Truth or Square aired, and well into his late 30s by the time the show reached its 25th anniversary in 2024. He does not look or behave like someone in his late 30s. He does not look or behave like someone who has aged a single day since the first episode aired. He wakes up every morning to the same bugle alarm, puts on the same uniform, and approaches the same job with the same enthusiasm, in the same small body, with the same face, inside a world that has accumulated hundreds of episodes of events, without any of those events leaving a visible mark on the person at the center of them. The question of why SpongeBob does not age is one the show has never answered directly, and most viewers absorb it the way they absorb most cartoon inconsistencies, as a feature of the medium rather than a mystery worth investigating. Animated characters do not age in most long-running cartoons. The Simpsons family has been the same ages for over 3 decades. The characters of Peanuts never grew up across 50 years of newspaper strips. Stasis is the default state of serialized animation, a practical necessity driven by the economics and logistics of keeping a franchise running across many years without having to redesign and recast everything to reflect the passage of time. Most viewers have absorbed this understanding well enough that they stop expecting animated characters to age without consciously deciding to stop expecting it. What separates SpongeBob's stasis from the ordinary cartoon variety theory is the specific way the show has introduced and then ignored information that should produce aging if taken seriously. The birth date on the identification card is one piece of that information. An episode called No Free Rides from the second season depicts Mrs. Puff giving SpongeBob a fraudulent passing grade on his boating exam purely to get him out of her classroom, and when he returns the following day having forgotten or simply disregarded the credential, she is back to teaching him from scratch. An episode called Karate Island depicts SpongeBob being lured to a location under false pretenses, escaping through his own resourcefulness, and returning home with no meaningful change to his understanding of himself or the world. An episode called Fools in April shows Squidward playing a cruel prank on SpongeBob severe enough to reduce him to genuine distress, apologizing, and then having the entire emotional event resolve without residue by the following episode. The show introduces specific experiences that would, in a realistic or even a semi-realistic fictional world, leave marks on the character who had them, and then removes those marks between episodes as cleanly as a slate being wiped. The theory that addresses this pattern most completely began circulating in various forms across fan communities through the early 2010s, and it reaches beyond the ordinary observation that cartoons reset their characters between episodes to make a more specific claim about what the reset means within the logic of this particular show. The claim is that SpongeBob's world is not simply a cartoon world operating under the conventional rules of serialized animation, but a world that is structurally designed to prevent change, trapping its inhabitants in a loop that resets everything significant while allowing trivial variations to accumulate across episodes without ever adding up to genuine development. The most popular name for this reading is the purgatory theory, though eternal reset and time loop appear in various versions depending on what specific mechanism the theory uses to explain the stasis. All of them are pointing at the same observed phenomenon, which is that the world of Bikini Bottom operates in a way that makes lasting consequence impossible for any of its central figures. The word purgatory carries specific theological weight that the theory does not always intend in its most literal sense. In Catholic tradition, purgatory is the state between death and heaven in which souls undergo purification, working through whatever prevented them from reaching heaven directly while alive. The purgatory reading of SpongeBob's world suggests, at its most direct, that SpongeBob is dead, that the relentlessly cheerful, endlessly repeating world he occupies is some form of afterlife designed around his personality and desires, and that the inability to progress, the eternal return to the same job and the same friends and the same small neighborhood, is the specific character of his condition, rather than a side effect of it. The show's depiction of Bikini Bottom as a place that looks and functions like a mid-century American suburb that never updates its aesthetic or its technology in any meaningful way despite supposedly existing in a contemporary setting, supports this reading visually in a way that is difficult to dismiss entirely once pointed out. An episode that the theory returns to repeatedly is called Spongehenge, and it comes from the 5th season. The premise involves SpongeBob becoming isolated after his appearance begins attracting jellyfish in such large numbers that he cannot move through Bikini Bottom without being mobbed. To escape, he constructs a series of stone structures sized to himself and tuned to produce a sound that keeps the jellyfish occupied in his absence, then flees to a cave where he waits for the jellyfish migration season to end. While he is waiting in the cave, the episode cuts to a sequence depicting the stone structures he left behind surviving into the future, observed by archaeologists who study them with the reverence usually reserved for actual ancient monuments. The jump forward in time shown in that sequence is not a small one. The carvings and the structures are depicted as genuinely ancient by the time the researchers are examining them, placing the episode's present moment at an uncertain but significant distance from the future it is briefly imagining. SpongeBob, sitting in his cave, has no access to any of this information. He is simply waiting for the season to change so he can go back to work. Another episode, called SB-129, places Squidward in a time machine and sends him thousands of years into the future, where Bikini Bottom has transformed into a gleaming, technologically advanced civilization that bears almost no resemblance to the contemporary version. Squidward then travels back in time to prehistoric Bikini Bottom, encountering primitive ancestors of SpongeBob and Patrick before eventually escaping to a featureless white void outside of time entirely. The episode uses its time travel structure as a delivery mechanism for comedy about Squidward's frustration rather than as a serious exploration of the show's relationship to time, but the world it briefly depicts, both the far future and the distant past, confirms that the show's own internal mythology treats Bikini Bottom as a place with a long and changing history on either side of the narrow present the show depicts. The present that SpongeBob occupies, frozen and repeating, exists between a deep past and a long future that are both allowed to change in ways the present is not. Patrick's intelligence is perhaps the most frequently cited evidence evidence for something genuinely unusual happening to the characters of Bikini Bottom across the show's run, because it fluctuates between episodes in ways that exceed anything attributable to simple cartoon inconsistency. Patrick can be, depending on the episode, someone whose thoughts are so disconnected from ordinary reasoning that he seems to inhabit a completely different cognitive world than everyone around him, and also someone who produces moments of startling, almost oracular clarity that cut through complex situations in ways no one else in the scene manages. He can remember things across episodes that he demonstrably should not be able to remember, and forget things within single episodes that should be well within his grasp. His behavior does not map onto any consistent psychological profile, and the show does not treat the inconsistency as a running joke about forgetfulness or confusion, but simply presents each version of Patrick as the true one in the episode where it appears, without acknowledging the contradiction. The eternal reset theory accounts for Patrick's fluctuation by suggesting that his character, like every character in Bikini Bottom, is not developing across episodes but resetting between them, meaning each episode draws a fresh version of Patrick calibrated to whatever the plot requires, without any accumulated continuity linking one Patrick to the next. This is a more extreme version of the standard cartoon character explanation, because it is not simply arguing that Patrick stays the same across episodes. It is arguing that he starts over, that the Patrick of any given episode is a clean instance rather than a continuation, which is why the smart Patrick of one episode and the almost non-functional Patrick of another can both exist without the show treating their gap as something requiring explanation. SpongeBob's boating test failure sits differently within this frame than it does within the SpongeNam theory discussed earlier in this video, though both readings observe the same basic fact. The SpongeNam theory reads the repeated failure as a trauma response specific to the act of driving, a localized breakdown that leaves everything else functional. The eternal reset theory reads it as something structurally different, evidence that the world SpongeBob occupies is designed to prevent him from passing the test regardless of how many times he attempts it, because passing the test would represent the kind of genuine, lasting progress that his world does not allow. Mrs. Puff has, across the show's run, come closer than anyone else in the cast to stating this directly, in moments where her despair about SpongeBob's boating performance tips into something that reads less like professional frustration and more like an awareness that she is participating in a situation that will not resolve, that her job and SpongeBob's failure are locked together in a way that no amount of teaching or testing or genuine effort on either side will change. The show has, in scattered moments across its run, depicted SpongeBob himself becoming aware that something about his situation is unusual, and those moments tend to be among the most tonally distinctive the series has produced. An episode called Rockabye Bivalve places him in a domestic situation that mirrors the structure of his ordinary life so closely that the parallels become hard to ignore, and his response to the pressures of that situation carries a quality of recognition rather than novelty, as though he is encountering a version of something familiar rather than something new. An episode called The Algae's Always Greener, which focuses primarily on plankton, places SpongeBob in an alternate version of his world, where the power relationships are reversed, and his adjustment to that alternate version is disturbingly smooth, suggesting either remarkable adaptability or an underlying familiarity with the principle of waking up in a world that operates by slightly different rules than the one he left. The show produced one moment across its entire run that the eternal reset theory tends to cite above all others, and it comes from an episode called Rockabye Bivalve, where SpongeBob reaches the end of an extended, exhausting domestic experience and makes a comment whose specific phrasing fans have returned to many times. The comment, delivered with the particular flatness of someone who has run out of a specific kind of energy, implies that the life he lives every day involves a degree of effort that does not show from the outside, that the cheerfulness and the routine and the performance of ordinary contentment cost him something that the world around him is not equipped to recognize or acknowledge. The episode does not develop this moment. It passes through it and continues, the way the show passes through most of its darker implications, without stopping to explain what it just revealed. But the moment is there, and the eternal reset theory uses it as its clearest piece of evidence that SpongeBob, on some level the show is unwilling to make fully explicit, knows that something about his situation is not what it appears to be. The real-world context of the show's production adds a layer to the theory that sits outside the text but reflects back onto it. Steven Hillenburg designed SpongeBob with a deliberate commitment to episodic rather than serialized storytelling, resisting the development of ongoing continuity precisely because he believed the show worked better when each episode was self-contained, when audiences could enter at any point without needing to have seen what came before. That creative philosophy, sustained throughout his involvement with the series, produced exactly the world the eternal eternal reset theory is describing, a place where events do not accumulate into change, where characters remain themselves across any number of experiences that would transform a realistic person, and where the rules of the world consistently protect the status quo against disruption. Hillenburg built the reset into the show deliberately, as a feature of the storytelling approach he believed in. The theory takes that deliberate choice and asks what it looks like from inside the world where it is operating, rather than from outside where it is simply a production decision. What the eternal reset theory finally arrives at, after working through all of its evidence, is a reading of SpongeBob's happiness that sits alongside the SpongeNam theory's reading without fully overlapping it. The SpongeNam theory says his happiness is an achievement built against difficulty. The eternal reset theory says his happiness is the appropriate response to his actual situation, which is that he exists in a world where nothing can get permanently worse, where every loss reverses and every disaster recovers, where Squidward will always be next door and Gary will always need feeding and the Krusty Krab will always open on time. If the world genuinely cannot move forward, then being happy in the present moment is not optimism or denial or the hard-won peace of a veteran managing his days. It is the only rational orientation available. The purgatory of Bikini Bottom, if that is what it is, was built around the specific desires of its central figure, and those desires are simple enough that their eternal repetition is not a punishment but a perfect fit. SpongeBob wanted to cook, and to have friends, and to live by the sea. The world gave him all three, and then made sure he would never have to lose them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A world that resets between episodes, and a character who never ages sit at the center of a theory that reframes the show's most basic creative decision as something considerably more deliberate than a production choice. The final theory in this video turns away from SpongeBob entirely and toward the object he is shaped like, asking what it means that the most recognized character in the history of the show was designed to look exactly like something humans throw away. Section 10. The kitchen sponge theory. Real sea sponges are not rectangular. They are not yellow. They are not perforated with neat, evenly spaced holes arranged across a flat surface in a pattern that looks like something engineered rather than grown. Real sea sponges are irregular, asymmetrical organisms that attach themselves to rock and coral and spend their lives filtering water through a system of internal channels, shaped by the specific pressures of their environment into forms that look nothing like anything a human household would recognize. They come in tubes, vases, branches, fans, and blobs. They do not come in squares. The decision to make the central character of a show created by a marine biologist look exactly like a kitchen sponge rather than a sea sponge was not an accident, and it was not simply a concession to recognizability, though recognizability was part of Hillenburg's stated reasoning for the choice. Something else is embedded in that design decision, and a theory that has circulated quietly at the edges of SpongeBob fan culture for years argues that the something else is the most important thing Hillenburg ever put into the show. Stephen Hillenburg spent years teaching marine science at the Ocean Institute in Dana Point, California, before he ever moved fully into animation. The Ocean Institute is an educational facility built around ocean science and maritime history, sitting on the Pacific coast and designed to bring students into direct contact with marine environments rather than studying them purely through textbooks and diagrams. Hillenburg taught there, developed educational materials there, and created an illustrated comic during that period called The Intertidal Zone, featuring anthropomorphic sea creatures used as vehicles for teaching real marine biology concepts that is recognized as the direct creative ancestor of SpongeBob SquarePants. The version of Bob the Sponge that appeared in the Intertidal Zone looked more like an actual sea sponge than the character who eventually appeared on Nickelodeon, which means the shift toward a kitchen sponge design was a conscious refinement made during the development process rather than the original concept. Hillenburg explained the shift toward the kitchen sponge shape in interviews given during the show's early years as a decision driven partly by humor and partly by legibility. A realistic sea sponge, he noted, would not read clearly to a general audience as a sympathetic, expressive character. A kitchen sponge, being an object already familiar to anyone who had ever cleaned a dish, carried immediate recognizability and offered a flat, nearly square surface that an animator could work with more expressively than an irregular organic shape. Those are practical justifications, and they are entirely plausible as the primary motivations behind the design choice. The theory does not argue that Hillenburg was lying about his practical reasoning. It argues that a man who spent years teaching children about the ocean, who cared enough about marine environments to structure his entire first career around sharing that care with students, and who specifically chose to create a show set underwater featuring sea creatures as its central characters, would not have chosen a kitchen sponge as his hero's design without being aware of what a kitchen sponge means when it ends ends up in the ocean. Kitchen sponges are one of the more persistent and specifically insidious forms of plastic pollution affecting marine environments. They are made from synthetic polyurethane foam, a petroleum-based material that does not biodegrade in any meaningful time frame under ocean conditions, and they reach the water through the ordinary channels of household waste disposal, wash down drains, or discarded in ways that eventually route them into waterways and then into the broader ocean system. Once in the water, they break down into microplastics rather than disappearing, releasing the same chemical components that make them durable cleaning tools into an environment where those chemicals interact with marine life in ways that are still being studied and documented. A kitchen sponge at the bottom of the ocean is not a visitor. It is a permanent fixture, present long after anyone on the surface has thought about it or remembered it was ever there, doing ongoing, mostly invisible harm to the environment surrounding it. The theory's central claim is that SpongeBob's kitchen sponge appearance is a deliberate visual reference to this reality, and that Hillenburg, working from his background as a marine educator who understood what human waste does to ocean environments, embedded a specific environmental commentary into the design of his most beloved character. The hero of the show, the character audiences are meant to identify with and root for across every episode, is shaped like human trash. He looks like something that was made on the surface, used by humans, and then found its way to the bottom of the ocean, where it built a life among the natural creatures already living there and became the most recognizable figure in that community. He is, in this reading, not a mutated sea creature like everyone around him, not a natural product of the environment he inhabits, but a foreign object that arrived from somewhere else and became so thoroughly embedded in its adopted home that nobody treats it as foreign anymore. The show itself provides a small number of direct references that the theory uses as textual support, scattered across episodes in the way that most of the show's darker embedded details are scattered, present and available to be noticed without ever being foregrounded by the narrative. An early episode from the first season features Squidward, in a moment of particular contempt for his neighbor, referring to SpongeBob specifically as a kitchen sponge, rather than the sea creature SpongeBob clearly considers himself to be. The line is played as an insult, a way of diminishing SpongeBob by calling him something artificial and disposable rather than something natural and alive, and SpongeBob's reaction treats it as a cutting remark rather than a simple factual error. The distinction between sea sponge and kitchen sponge matters to the characters within the show, which means the show itself is aware the distinction exists, and the fact that SpongeBob visually resembles the latter rather than the former is something the show has chosen to build into both the character design and the dialogue rather than simply leaving as an unexplained visual choice. The human presence above Bikini Bottom functions within the theory as the broader frame that makes SpongeBob's kitchen sponge identity meaningful rather than incidental. Humans in this show are never seen directly interacting with Bikini Bottom's community in any sustained way, but their presence above the water's surface is a constant and defining feature of the world. Fishing hooks drop into the water at regular intervals across the show's run, visible from below as glowing, baited threats that the characters have learned to recognize and avoid with varying degrees of success. Boats pass overhead, creating shadows and disturbances that affect the community below. The surface world is where Sandy comes from, where the equipment that endangers Mr. Krabs came from, and where the nuclear tests that produced Bikini Bottom's entire population of talking, thinking creatures were conducted. Humans are the permanent background force in this world, shaping everything below the surface without ever fully descending into it. A kitchen sponge at the bottom of the ocean connects directly to that human background, because kitchen sponges do not appear at the bottom of the ocean through any natural process. They get there because humans put them there through the accumulation of disposal and discard that roots human waste into water systems and eventually into open ocean. If SpongeBob is a kitchen sponge, his origin is in that human world above the surface, not in the natural ocean ecosystem he calls home. He arrived in Bikini Bottom the way pollution arrives anywhere, not through any intention or plan, but through the ordinary mechanical processes of human waste moving toward the sea. And once there, he became part of the community with an enthusiasm and a completeness that the community itself seems to have accepted entirely, the way an ecosystem eventually incorporates a foreign object that has been present long enough, building around it rather than expelling it. This reading produces an unusual relationship between SpongeBob and Sandy Cheeks within the theory's frame. Sandy is the character who bridges the surface world and the underwater world most directly, living in an underwater habitat but maintaining her connection to the surface through her biology, her identity, and her institutional affiliations. She arrived in Bikini Bottom with a mission. She studies its creatures from inside a dome that keeps the ocean out. She is, in a specific and documented sense, a surface world entity operating in the deep. SpongeBob, in the kitchen sponge reading, is also a surface world entity operating in the deep, but one who arrived without a mission, without awareness, and without any connection to the institutional structures that sent Sandy there. Their friendship in this reading becomes something more quietly resonant than two characters who happen to meet and get along. It becomes a relationship between two objects from the same world of origin, one of whom knows it and one of whom does not, both finding themselves at the bottom of the Pacific for reasons that trace back, by different routes, to the same human activity above. Hillenburg's documented resistance to commercializing SpongeBob in ways that felt inconsistent with the show's values adds a specific dimension to the theory that sits outside the text but reflects back onto it with some force. He specifically and publicly objected to the use of SpongeBob's image to market fast food to children, stating that he had built the character with a different purpose in mind, and that using an animated sea creature to sell hamburgers to children ran against what he had intended the character to represent. A man who designed a character shaped like kitchen waste and then objected to that character being used to market food products is making a specific and internally consistent set of choices. The original design carried a commentary about what humans make and discard. Using that design to sell more products to consumers whose habits produce the waste the design references would undercut the commentary at its foundation, which may be part of what Hillenburg found objectionable about the arrangement, beyond simply protecting his artistic vision in a general sense. The environmental dimension of the theory connects it to a pattern in Hillenburg's creative history that predates the show itself. The Intertidal Zone, the educational comic he produced during his teaching years, used cartoon sea creatures as vehicles for explaining real ocean biology to students, making complex scientific content accessible through character and humor while preserving the accuracy of the underlying information. SpongeBob represents a continuation of that project through a different medium and for a much larger audience, and the kitchen sponge design could be understood as Hillenburg's way of embedding a piece of genuine marine science education into the show's most basic visual element, the hero's appearance, in a way that operates below the level of conscious reading for most viewers without ever being untrue. Every child who watched SpongeBob was looking at a shape they recognized from their own home, and the gap between what that shape does in the home and what it does in the ocean was a gap Hillenburg knew better than most people alive exactly how important it was. The theory's most affecting implication surfaces when all of it is considered together with the eternal reset theory from the previous section. If SpongeBob is trapped in a world that cannot change, returning to the same job and the same street and the same small life across every episode without accumulation or development, and if the shape of his body is the shape of something humans made and then threw away, then the specific character of his stasis carries an additional weight. Pollution does not choose to stay. A kitchen sponge at the bottom of the ocean does not return to the surface, does not find its way back to the home where it was used, does not escape the environment it was introduced to by accident. It stays because staying is the only option available to something that arrived without any mechanism for leaving. SpongeBob's eternal return to the same morning alarm and the same pressed uniform and the same fryer and the same friends is not only the structure of a cartoon committed to episodic storytelling. In the kitchen sponge reading, it is also the natural condition of something that ended up somewhere it was not made for and found, against all probability, that the place suited it perfectly. What the kitchen sponge theory does that the other 9 theories in this video do not is locate the show's emotional center, not in any character's psychology or backstory or supernatural arrangement, but in the most fundamental visual fact of the show, the shape of its hero. All of the other theories ask what is hidden underneath the surface of something that appears simple. This theory asks what is visible in plain sight that the audience has looked at in every episode without registering what it is looking at. SpongeBob has been on screen for 25 years. His face has been on lunchboxes and backpacks and themed meals at fast food chains and merchandise across 100 categories. His image is among the most reproduced cartoon images in the history of the medium, and he is shaped like something people throw away. A man who spent his early career standing at the edge of the Pacific Ocean, trying to teach children that the sea was worth caring about, worth understanding, worth protecting from the kind of careless damage that human habits inflict on it without anyone intending harm, designed the face of one of the most beloved children's characters in history to look like the kind of thing that ends up on the ocean floor because nobody thought carefully about where it would go when they were done with it. Whether Hillenburg intended every layer of the reading assembled here is something that cannot be confirmed, and the practical explanations he gave for the kitchen sponge design are real and not dishonest. A character who reads clearly to a mass audience is a practical necessity for a show, and a kitchen sponge reads more clearly than a sea sponge to a child who has never studied marine biology. Both things can be true at the same time. The practical justification and the embedded commentary are not in conflict. They are, if the theory is right, the same decision viewed from two different distances, one close enough to see the immediate commercial logic and one far enough back back to see what the shape means in the world Hillenberg actually knew and cared about, the real ocean, the one with the real contamination and the real waste and the real creatures, navigating a world that human activity had been changing for decades before a marine biologist sat down and drew a square yellow character who lived in a pineapple at the bottom of it. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.